Hello, everyone. Welcome to more of Muse Reads. Today, we're reading some horror, as picked by our members. I figured this was going to be the winner. Ring by Koji Suzuki, which, yes, was the book that inspired the film The Ring. If you've never read it, it's quite different compared to both film adaptations, Western and Eastern, which were directed by the same guy, so they both have some interesting aspects to them, in my opinion. The changes made, I think, were done because it would have been hard to explore the ideas that the book does in a film environment. It's hard to say without giving spoilers, but basically, some of the characters in the book are real nasty, and the characters have a lot of internal dialogues about why they are the way they are that you couldn't really do in a film. So I think that's probably why they changed some characters around and got rid of some things. Yes, so this is Ring by Koji Suzuki, translation by Robert B. Romer and Glenn Wally. I don't know when this is from. This is probably a decade or two old. Probably came out when the movies were big. Alright, we will start with part 1, Autumn. September 5th, 1990, 10:49 p.m., Yokohama. A row of condominium buildings, each 14 stories high, ran along the northern edge of the housing development next to the Sakien Gardens. Although built only recently, nearly all the units were occupied. Nearly 100 dwellings were crammed into each building, but most of the inhabitants had never seen the faces of their neighbors. The only proof that people lived here came at night, when the windows lit up. Off to the south, the oily surface of the ocean reflected the glittering lights of a factory. A maze of pipes and conduits crawled along the factory walls like blood vessels on muscle tissue. Countless lights played over the front wall of the factory like insects that glow in the dark. Even this grotesque scene had a certain type of beauty. The factory cast a wordless shadow on the black sea beyond. A few hundred meters closer in the housing development, a single new 2-story home stood among empty lots spaced at precise intervals. Its front door opened directly onto the street, which ran north and south, and beside it was a 1-car garage. The home was ordinary, like those found in any new housing development anywhere, but there were no other houses behind or beside it. Perhaps owing to their inconvenience for transport links, few of the lots had been sold, and for sale signs could be seen here and there all along the street. Compared to the condos, which were completed at about the same time and which were immediately snapped up by buyers, the housing development looked quite lonely. A beam of fluorescent light fell from an open window on the second floor of the house, onto the dark surface of the street below. The light, the only one in the house, came from the room of Tomoko Ooshi. Dressed in shorts and a white t-shirt, she was slouched in a chair reading a book for school. Her body was twisted into an impossible position, legs stretched out toward an electric fan on the floor. Fanning herself with the hem of her t-shirt to allow the breeze to hit her bare flesh, she muttered about the heat to no one in particular. A senior at a private girls' high school, she had let her homework pile up over the summer vacation. She had played too much, and she blamed it on the heat. The summer, however, hadn't really been all that hot. There hadn't been many clear days, and she hadn't been able to spend nearly as much time at the beach as she did most summers. And what's more, as soon as vacation was over, there were 5 straight days of perfect summer weather. It irritated Tomoko. She resented this clear sky. How was she supposed to study in this stupid heat? With the hand she had been running through her hair, Tomoko reached over to turn up the volume of the radio. She saw a moth alight on the window screen beside her, then fly away somewhere, blown by the wind from the fan. The screen trembled slightly for a moment after the bug had vanished into the darkness. She had a test tomorrow, but she was getting nowhere. Tomoko Ooshi wasn't going to be ready for it, even if she pulled an all-nighter. She looked at the clock. Almost 11. She thought of watching the day's baseball wrap-up on TV. Maybe she'd catch a glimpse of her parents in the infilled seats. But Tomoko, who desperately wanted to get to college, was worried about the test. All she had to do was get into college. It didn't matter where, as long as it was a college. Even then, what an unfulfilling summer vacation it had been. The foul weather had kept her from having any real fun, while the oppressive humidity had kept her from getting any work done. It was my last summer in high school. I wanted to go out with a bang, and now it's all over. The end. Her mind strayed to a meatier target than the weather to vent her bad mood on. And what's with Mom and Dad anyway, leaving their daughter all alone studying like this, covered in sweat, while they go gallivanting out to a ball game? Why don't they think about my feelings for a change? Seems like a typical teenager. Someone at work had unexpectedly given her father a pair of tickets to the Giants game, and so her parents had gone to Tokyo Dome. By now, it was almost time for them to be getting home, unless they had gone out somewhere after the game. For the moment, Tomoko was home alone in their brand new house. It was strangely humid, considering that it hadn't rained in several days. In addition to the perspiration that oozed from her body, a dampness seemed to hang in the air. Tomoko unconsciously slapped at her thigh. But when she moved her hand away, she could find no trace of the mosquito. An itch began to develop just above her knee, but maybe it was just her imagination. She heard a buzzing sound. Tomoko waved her hands over her head. A fly. It flew suddenly upwards to escape the draft from the fan and disappeared from view. How had a fly gotten into the room? The door was closed. Tomoko checked the window screens, but nowhere could she find a hole big enough to admit a fly. She suddenly realized she was thirsty. She also needed to pee. She felt stifled, not exactly like she was suffocating, but like there was a weight pressing down on her chest. For some time, Tomoko had been complaining to herself about how unfair life was, but now she was like a different person as she lapsed into silence. As she started down, she just stood at the top of the stairs and stared. As she started down the stairs, her heart began to pound for no reason. Headlights from a passing car grazed across the wall at the foot of the stairs and slipped away. As the sound of the car's engine faded into the distance, the darkness in the house seemed to grow more intense. Tomoko intentionally made a lot of noise going down the stairs and turned on the light in the downstairs hall. She remained seated on the toilet, lost in thought, for a long time, even after she'd finished peeing. The violent beating of her heart still had not subsided. She'd never experienced anything like this before. What was going on? She took several deep breaths to steady herself, then stood up and pulled up her shorts. "Mom and Dad, please get home soon," she said to herself, suddenly sounding very girlish. Ugh, gross, who am I talking to? It wasn't like she was addressing her parents, asking them to come home. She was asking someone else. "Hey, stop scaring me, please." Before she knew it, she was even asking politely. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. Without drying them, she took some ice cubes from the freezer, dropped them in a glass, and filled it with Coke. She drained the glass in a single gulp and set it on the counter. The ice cubes swirled in the glass for a moment, then settled. Tomoko shivered. She felt cold. Her throat was still dry. She took the big bottle of Coke from the refrigerator and refilled her glass. Her hands were shaking now. She had a feeling there was something behind her. Something. Definitely not a person. The sour stench of rotting flesh melted into the air around her, enveloping her. It couldn't be anything corporeal. "Stop it, please!" she begged, speaking aloud now. The 15-watt fluorescent bulb over the kitchen sink flickered on and off like ragged breathing. It had to be new, but its light seemed pretty unreliable right now. Suddenly, Tomoko wished she had hit the switch that turned on all the lights in the kitchen, but she couldn't walk over to where the switch was. She couldn't even turn around. She knew what was behind her. A Japanese-style room of 8 tatami mats, with the Buddhist altar dedicated to her grandfather's memory in the alcove. Through the slightly open curtains, she'd be able to see the grass in the empty lots and a thin strip of light from the condos beyond. There shouldn't be anything else. By the time she'd drunk half the second glass of cola, Tomoko couldn't move at all. The feeling was too intense. She couldn't be just imagining the presence. She was sure that something was reaching out even now to touch her on the neck. What if it's... She didn't want to think the rest. If she did, if she went on like that, she'd remember, and she didn't think she could withstand the terror. It had happened a week ago, so long ago she'd forgotten. It was all Suichi's fault. He shouldn't have said that. Later, none of them could stop. But then they'd come back to the city, and those scenes, those vivid images, hadn't seemed quite as believable. The whole thing had just been someone's idea of a joke. Tomoko tried to think about something more cheerful. Anything besides that. But if it had been real, after all, the phone did ring, didn't it? "Oh, Mom and Dad, what are you doing? Come home!" Tomoko cried aloud. But even after she spoke, the eerie shadows showed no signs of dissipating. It was behind her, keeping still, watching and waiting for its chance to arrive. At 17, Tomoko didn't know what true terror was, but she did know that there were fears that grew in the imagination of their own accord. That must be it. Yeah, that's all it is. When I turn around, there won't be anything there. Nothing at all. Tomoko was seized by a desire to turn around. She wanted to confirm that there was nothing there and get herself out of the situation. But was that all there really was to it? An evil chill seemed to rise up around her shoulders, spread to her back, and began to slither down her spine, lower and lower. Her t-shirt was soaked with cold sweat. Her physical responses were too strong for it to be just her imagination. Didn't someone say your body is more honest than your mind? Yet another voice spoke too. Turn around. There shouldn't be anything there. If you don't finish your Coke and get back to your studies, there's no telling how you'll do on the test tomorrow. In the glass, an ice cube cracked. As if spurred by the sound, without stopping to think, Tomoko spun around. I really love how he builds up tension with just the mind. Nothing really happens in any of this. It's just her thoughts. But something happens. It's a lot more intense, I think, than the film. The film is really visually... It's a lot of fun. It's really visually creepy. But I think the book is the more frightening version of the story. If only because it can get into people's thoughts and their mind and really show what they're thinking. September 5th, 10:54 p.m. Tokyo, the intersection in front of Shinagawa Station. The light turned yellow right in front of him. He could have darted through, but instead, Kimura pulled his cab over to the curb. He was hoping to pick up a fare headed for Roppongi Crossing. A lot of customers he picked up there were bound for Akasaka or Roppongi, and it wasn't uncommon for people to jump in while he was stopped at a light like this. A motorcycle nosed up between Kimura's taxi and the curb and came to a stop just at the edge of the crossing. The rider was a young man dressed in jeans. Kimura got annoyed by motorcycles, the way they wove and darted their way through traffic like this. He especially hated it when he was waiting at a light and a bike came up and stopped right by his door, blocking it. And today he had been hassled by customers all day long and was in a foul mood. Kimura cast a sour look at the biker. His face was hidden by his helmet visor. One leg rested on the curb of the sidewalk, his knees spread wide, and he rocked his body back and forth in a thoroughly slovenly manner. A young lady with nice legs walked by on the sidewalk. The biker turned his head to watch her go by, but his gaze didn't follow her the whole way. His head had swiveled about 90 degrees when he seemed to fix his gaze on the show window behind her. The woman walked on out of his field of vision. The biker was left behind, staring intently at something. The walk light began to flash and then went out. Pedestrians caught in the middle of the street began to hurry, crossing right in front of the taxi. Nobody raised a hand or headed for his cab. Kimura revved the engine and waited for the light to turn green. Just then, the biker seemed to be seized by a great spasm, raising both arms and collapsing against Kimura's taxi. He fell against the door of the cab with a loud thump and disappeared from view. You asshole. The kid must have lost his balance and fallen over, thought Kimura as he turned on his blinkers and got out of the car. If the door was damaged, he intended to make the kid pay for the repairs. The light turned green and the cars behind Kimura's began to pass by into the intersection. The biker was lying face up on the street, thrashing his legs, and struggling with both hands to remove his helmet. Before checking out the kid, though, Kimura first looked at his meal ticket. Just as he had expected, there was a long, angling crease in the door panel. Shit! Kimura clicked his tongue in disgust as he approached the fallen man. Despite the fact that the strap was still securely fastened under his chin, the guy was desperately trying to remove his helmet. He seemed ready to rip his own head off in the process. Does it hurt that bad? Kimura realized now that something was seriously wrong with the rider. He finally squatted down next to him and asked, "You all right?" Because of the tinted visor, he couldn't make out the man's expression. The biker clutched at Kimura's hand and seemed to be begging for something. He was almost clinging to Kimura. He said nothing. He didn't try to raise the visor. Kimura jumped to action. "Hold on, I'll call an ambulance." Running to a public telephone, Kimura puzzled over how a simple fall from a standing position could have turned into this. He must have hit his head just right. But don't be stupid. The idiot was wearing a helmet, right? He doesn't look like he broke an arm or a leg. I hope this doesn't turn into a pain in the ass. It wouldn't be too good for me if he hurt himself running into my car. Kimura had a bad feeling about this. So if he really is hurt, does it come out of my insurance? That means an accident report, which means the cops... When he hung up and went back, the man was lying unmoving with his hands clutching his throat. Several passerbys had stopped and were looking on with concerned expressions. Kimura pushed his way through the people, making sure everybody knew it had been he who had called the ambulance. Hey, hang in there. The ambulance is on its way." Kimura unfastened the chin strap of the helmet. It came right off. Kimura couldn't believe how the guy had been struggling with it earlier. The man's face was amazingly distorted. The only word that could describe his expression was astonishment. Both eyes were wide open and staring, and his bright red tongue was stuck in the back of his throat, blocking it, while saliva drooled from the corner of his mouth. The ambulance would be arriving too late. When his hands had touched the kid's throat in removing his helmet, he hadn't felt a pulse. Kimura shuddered. The scene was losing reality. One wheel of the fallen motorcycle still spun slowly, and oil leaked from the engine, pooling in the street and running into the sewer. There was no breeze. The night sky was clear, while directly over their heads the stoplight turned red again. Kimura rose shakily to his feet, clutching at the guardrail that ran along the sidewalk. From there, he looked once more at the man lying in the street. The man's head, pillowed on his helmet, was bent at nearly a right angle, an unnatural posture no matter how you looked at it. Did I put it there? Did I put his head on his helmet like that? Like a pillow? For what? He couldn't recall the past several seconds. Those wide-open eyes were looking at him. A sinister chill swept over him. Lukewarm air seemed to pass right over his shoulders. It was a tropical evening, but Kimura found himself shivering uncontrollably. I wonder what these two mysterious incidences have to do with each other. I know Billy has read these, right? Is nobody else know the books? I'm sure most of us have probably seen one or the other of the films, because they're quite popular. But there's some differences, so you may not be able to guess what's going to happen. Chapter 2. The early morning light of autumn reflected off the green surface of the inner moat of the Imperial Palace. September's stifling heat was finally fading. Kazuyuki Asakawa was halfway down to the subway platform, but suddenly he had a change of heart. He wanted a closer look at the water he'd been looking at from the 9th floor. It felt like the filthy air of the editorial offices had filtered down here to the basement levels, like dregs settling to the bottom of a bottle. He wanted to breathe outside air. He climbed the stairs to the street. With the green of the palace grounds in front of him, the exhaust fumes generated from the confluence of the No. 5 expressway and the ring road didn't seem so noxious. The brightening sky shone in the cool of the morning. Asakawa was physically fatigued from having worked all night, but he wasn't especially sleepy. The fact that he'd completed his article stimulated him and kept his brain cells active. He hadn't taken a day off for 2 weeks and planned to spend today and tomorrow at home resting up. He was just going to take it easy, on orders from the editor-in-chief. He saw an empty taxi coming from the direction of Kudenshita, and he instinctively raised his hand. 2 days ago, his subway commuter pass from Takabashi to Shinbaba had expired, and he hadn't bought a new one yet. It cost 400 yen to get to his condominium in Kita Shinagawa from here by subway, while it cost nearly 2,000 yen to go by cab. He hated to waste over 1,500 yen, but when he thought of the 3 transfers he'd have to make on the subway, and the fact that he'd just gotten paid, he decided he could splurge just this once. Asakawa's decision to take a taxi on this day, at this spot, was nothing more than a whim, the outcome of a series of innocuous impulses. He hadn't emerged from the subway with the intention of hailing a cab. He'd been seduced by the outside air at the very moment that a taxi had approached with its red, vacant lamplit. And in that instant, the thought of buying a ticket and transferring through 3 separate stations seemed like more effort than he could stand. If he had taken the subway home, however, a certain pair of incidents would almost certainly never have been connected. Of course, a story always begins with such a coincidence. The taxi pulled to a hesitant stop in front of the Palace Side building. The driver was a small man of about 40, and it looked like he too had been up all night, his eyes were so red. There was a color mug shot on the dashboard with the driver's name, Mikio Kimura, written beside it. "Kita Shinagawa, please." Hearing the destination, Kimura felt like doing a little dance. Kita Shinagawa was just past his company's garage in Higashi Gotanda, and since it was the end of his shift, he was planning to go in that direction anyway. Moments like this, when he guessed right and things went his way, reminded him that he liked driving a cab. Suddenly, he felt like talking. "You covering a story?" His eyes bloodshot with fatigue, Asakawa was looking out the window and letting his mind drift when the driver asked this. "Huh?" He replied, suddenly alert, wondering how the cabbie knew his profession. "You're a reporter, right? From the newspaper?" "Yeah, their weekly magazine, actually. But how did you know?" Kimura had been driving a taxi for nearly 20 years and could pretty much guess at a fare's occupation depending on where he picked them up, what he was wearing, and how he talked. If the person had a glamorous job and was proud of it, he was always ready to talk about it. "It must be hard having to work this early in the morning." "No, just the opposite. I'm on my way home to sleep." "Well, you're just like me then." Asakawa usually didn't feel much pride in his work, but this morning he was feeling the same satisfaction he'd felt the first time he'd seen an article of his appear in print. He'd finally finished a series he'd been working on, and it had drawn quite a reaction. "Is your work interesting?" "Yeah, I guess so," said Asakawa, non-committally. Sometimes it was interesting, and sometimes it wasn't, but right now he couldn't be bothered to go into detail. He still hadn't forgotten his disastrous failure of 2 years ago. He could clearly remember the title of the article he'd been working on, "The New Gods of Modernity." In his mind's eye, he could still picture the wretched figure he'd cut as he stood quaking before the editor-in-chief to tell him he couldn't go on as a reporter. For a while, there was silence in the taxi. They took the curve just left of Kyoto Tower. I don't know why I just changed Tokyo to Kyoto. Tokyo Tower at a considerable speed. "Excuse me," said Kimura. "Should I take the Canal Road or the number 1 Kihin?" One route or the other would be more convenient depending on where they were going in Kita Shinagawa. "Take the expressway. Let me out just before Shinbaba." A taxi driver can relax a bit once he knows precisely where his fare is going. Kimura turned right at Fuda no Shuji. They were approaching it now, the intersection Kimura had been unable to put out of his mind for the past month. Unlike Asakawa, who was haunted by his failure, Kimura was able to look back at the incident fairly objectively. After all, he hadn't been responsible for the accident, so he hadn't had to do any soul-searching because of it. It was entirely the other guy's fault, and no amount of caution on Kimura's part could have warded it off. He'd completely overcome the terror he'd felt. A month. Was that a long time ago? Asakawa was still in the thrall to the terror he'd known 2 years ago. Still, Kimura couldn't explain why. Every time he passed this place, he felt compelled to tell people about what happened. If Kimura glanced in his rearview mirror and saw that his fare was sleeping, he'd give up. But if not, he'd tell every passenger, without exception, everything that had occurred. It was a compulsion. Every time he'd go through that intersection, he was overcome by a compulsion to talk about it. The damnedest thing happened right here about a month ago. As though it had been waiting for Kimura to begin his story, the light in the intersection changed from yellow to red. "You know, a lot of strange things happen in this world." Kimura tried to catch his passenger's interest by hinting in this way at the nature of this story. Asakawa had been half asleep, but now he lifted his head suddenly and looked around him frantically. He'd been startled awake by the sound of Kimura's voice and was now trying to figure out where they were. "Is sudden death on the increase these days? Among young people, I mean." "Huh?" The phrase resonated in Asakawa's ears. Sudden death. Kimura continued. Well, it's just that, I guess it was about a month ago. I'm right over there, sitting in my cab, waiting for the light to change, and suddenly this motorbike just falls over on me. It wasn't like he was moving and took a spill. He was standing still, and suddenly, wham! And what do you think happened next? Oh, the driver, he was a prep school kid, 19 years old. He died, the idiot. Surprised the hell out of me, I can tell you that. So there's an ambulance and the cops, and then my cab, he banged into it, see. Quite a scene, I tell ya. Asakawa was listening silently, but as a 10-year veteran reporter, he'd developed an intuition about things like this. Instinctively, he made a note of the driver's name and the name of the cab company. The way he died was a little weird, too. He was desperately trying to pull off his helmet. I mean, just trying to rip it off, lying on his back and thrashing around. I went to call the ambulance, and by the time I got back, he was stiff. Where did you say this happened? Asakawa was fully awake now. Right over there, see? Kimura pointed to the crossing in front of the station. Shinagawa Station was located in the Takanawa area of Minato Ward. Asakawa burned this fact into his memory. An accident there would have fallen under the jurisdiction of the Takanawa precinct. In his mind, he quickly worked out which of his contacts could give him access to the Takanawa police station. This was when it was nice to work for a major newspaper. They had connections everywhere, and sometimes their ability to gather information was better than the police bureaus. So they called it sudden death. He wasn't sure if that was a proper medical term. He asked in a hurry now, not even realizing why this accident was striking such a chord with him. It's ridiculous, right? My cab was totally stopped. He just went and fell on it. It was all him. But I had to file an accident report, and I came this close to having it show up on my insurance record. I tell you, it was a total disaster, out of the blue. Do you remember exactly what day and time this all happened? You smell a story. September, let me see, 4th or 5th must have been. Time was just around 11 at night, I think. As soon as he said this, Kimura had a flashback. The muggy air, the pitch-black oil leaking from the fallen bike. The oil looked like a living thing as it crept toward the sewer. Headlamps reflected off its surface as it formed viscous drops and soundlessly oozed into the street drain. That moment when it had seemed like his sensory apparatus had failed him. And then the shocked face of the dead man, head pillowed on his helmet. What had been so astonishing anyway? The light turned green. Kimura stepped on the gas. From the back seat came the sound of a ballpoint pen on paper. Asakawa was making notes. Kimura felt nauseated. Why was he recalling it so vividly? He swallowed the bitter bile that had welled up and fought off the nausea. What did you say was the cause of death? Said Asakawa. Heart attack. Heart attack? Was that really the coroner's diagnosis? He didn't think they used that term anymore. I'll have to verify that along with the date and time, murmured Asakawa as he continued to make notes. In other words, there were absolutely no external injuries? Yeah, that's right. Absolutely none. It was just the shock. I mean, I'm the one who ought to be shocked, right? Huh? Well, I mean, the stiff, he had this look of complete shock on his face. Asakawa felt something click in his mind. At the same time, a voice in him denied any connection between the two incidents. Just a coincidence, that's all. Shinbaba Station on the Keihin Kyuko, I said that right, light rail line loomed up in front of them. At the next light, turn left and stop there, please. The taxi stopped and the door opened. Asakawa handed over 2,000 yen notes along with one of his business cards. My name's Asakawa. I'm with the Daily News. If it's all right with you, I'd like to hear about this in more detail later. Okay by me, said Kimura, sounding pleased. For some reason, he felt like that was his mission. I'll call you tomorrow or the day after. Do you want my number? Never mind, I wrote down the name of your company. I see it's not far away. Asakawa got out of the taxi and was about to close the door when he hesitated for a moment. He felt an unnameable dread at the thought of confirming what he'd heard. Maybe I'd better not stick my nose into anything funny. It could just be a replay of the last time. But now that his interest had been aroused, he couldn't just walk away. He knew that all too well. He asked Kimura one last time. The guy, he was struggling in pain, trying to get his helmet off, right? That's the end of chapter 2. I need some water. I'll be right back. It's right over here. I have a little bucket. Fill my water bottle. Blah.
candy? No, I was up for 1 second, and you stole my spot. Don't do this. It's very rude. Very rude, Gandalf.
All right. So, mysteries. We have a teen girl who dies in the middle of the night. Or, well, okay, I guess we don't know what happened to her. She thought something was happening and she turned around and that's where it ended. And then a guy dies on a motorcycle. And then this reporter gets in a cab and he's having these thoughts of, oh, this sounds like something else I heard about. Chapter 3. Oguri, his editor, scowled as he listened to Asakawa's report. Suddenly he was remembering what Asakawa had been like 2 years ago. Hunched over his word processor day and night like a man possessed, he'd labored at a biography of the guru Shoko Kageyama, incorporating all his research and more. Something wasn't right about him then. So bedeviled was he that Oguri had even tried to get him to see a shrink. Part of the problem was that it had been right then. 2 years ago, the whole publishing industry had been caught up in an unprecedented occult boom. Photos of ghosts had swamped the editorial offices. Every publisher in the every publisher in the country had been deluged with accounts and photographs of supernatural experiences. Every one of them was a hoax. Oguri had wondered what the world was coming to. He'd figured that he had a pretty good handle on the way the world worked, but he just couldn't think of a convincing explanation for that kind of thing. It was utterly preposterous, the number of contributors that had crawled out of the woodwork. It was no exaggeration to say that the office had been buried daily by mail, and every package dealt with the occult in some way. And it wasn't just the Daily News that was the target of this outpouring. Every publisher in Japan worthy of the name had been swept up in the incomprehensible phenomenon. Sighing over the time they were wasting, they'd made a rough survey of the claims. Most of the submissions were predictably anonymous, but it was concluded that there was no one out there who was sending out multiple manuscripts under assumed names. At a rough estimate, this meant that about 10 million different individuals had sent letters to one publisher or another. 10 million people. The figure was staggering. The stories themselves weren't nearly as terrifying as the fact that there were so many of them. In effect, 1 out of 10 people in the country had sent something in, yet not a single person in the industry, nor their families and friends, were counted among the informants. What was going on? Editors everywhere scratched their heads, and then, before anyone could figure it out, the wave began to recede. The strange phenomenon went on for about 6 months, and then, as if it had all been a dream, editorial rooms had returned to normal, and they no longer received any submissions of that nature. It had been Oguri's responsibility to determine how the weekly of a major newspaper publisher should react to all this. The conclusion he came to was they should ignore it scrupulously. Oguri strongly suspected that the spark had been set off from a class of magazines he routinely referred to as the rags. By running readers' photos and tales, they'd stoked the public's fever for this sort of thing and created a monstrous state of affairs. Of course, Oguri knew this couldn't quite explain it all away, but he had to approach the situation with logic of some sort. Eventually, the editorial staff from Oguri on down had taken to hauling all this mail unopened to the incinerator, and they dealt with the world just the way they had, as if nothing untoward was happening. They maintained a strict policy of not printing anything on the occult, turning a deaf ear to the anonymous sources. Whether or not that did the trick, the unprecedented tide of submissions began to ebb. And of all times, it was then that Asakawa had foolishly, recklessly, run around pouring oil on the dying flames. Oguri fixed Asakawa with a dour gaze. Was he going to make the same mistake twice? Now listen, you. Whenever Oguri couldn't figure out what to say, he started out like this. Now listen, you. I know what you're thinking, sir. Now, I'm not saying it's not interesting. We don't know what'll jump out at us. But look, if what jumps out at us looks anything like it did that other time, I won't like it very much. Last time. Oguri still believed that the occult boom 2 years ago had been engineered. He hated the occult for all he'd gone through on account of it, and his bias was alive and kicking after 2 years. I'm not trying to suggest anything mystical here. All I'm saying is that it couldn't have been a coincidence. A coincidence, Oguri cupped a hand to his ear and once again tried to sort out the story. Asakawa's wife's niece, Tomoko Oishi, had died at her home in Honmoku at around 11 p.m. on the 5th of September. The cause of death was sudden heart failure. She was a high school senior, only 17. On the same day, at the same time, a 19-year-old prep school student on a motorcycle had died, also of a cardiac infarction, while waiting for a light in front of Shinagawa Station. Sounds to me it's nothing but coincidence. You hear about the accident from your cab driver, you remember your wife's niece. Nothing more than that, right? On the contrary, Asakawa stated and paused for effect. Then he said, the kid on the motorcycle at the moment he died was struggling to pull off his helmet. So? Tomoko, too, when her body was discovered, she seemed to have been tearing at her head. Her fingers were tightly entwined in her own hair. Asakawa had met Tomoko on several occasions. Like any high school girl, she paid a lot of attention to her hair, shampooing it every day, that sort of thing. Why would a girl like that be tearing out her precious hair? He didn't know the true nature of whatever it was that had made her do that, but every time Asakawa thought of her pulling desperately at her hair, he imagined some sort of invisible thing to go along with the indescribable horror she must have felt. I don't know. Now listen, are you sure you're not coming at this with preconceived notions? If you took any two incidents, you could find things in common if you look hard enough. You're saying they both died of a heart attack, so they must have been in a lot of pain. She's pulling at her hair, he's struggling with his helmet. It sounds pretty normal to me. While he had to recognize that this was a possibility, Asakawa shook his head. He wasn't going to be defeated so easily. But sir, then it would be the chest that hurt. Why would they be tearing at their heads? Now listen, have you ever had a heart attack? Well, no. Have you asked a doctor about it? About what? About whether or not a person having a heart attack would tear at his head. Asakawa fell silent. He had, in fact, asked a doctor. The doctor had replied, I couldn't rule it out. It was a wishy-washy answer. After all, the opposite sometimes happens. Sometimes when a person experiences a cerebral hemorrhage or bleeding in the cerebral membrane, they feel stomach discomfort at the same time as a headache. So it depends on the individual. When there's a tough math problem, some people scratch their heads, some people smoke, some people may even rub their bellies. Oguri swiveled in his chair as he said this. The point is, we can't say anything at this stage, can we? We don't have space for that stuff. Because of what happened 2 years ago. We won't touch this kind of thing, not lightly. If we felt fine about speculating in print, then we could, of course. Maybe so. Maybe it was just like his editor said. It was a freak coincidence. But still, in the end, the doctor had just shaken his head. He'd pressed the doctor. Do heart attack victims really pull out their own hair? And the doctor had just frowned and said, His look had said it all. None of the patients he'd seen had acted like that. Yes, sir, I understand. At the moment, there was nothing to do but retreat meekly. If he couldn't discover a more objective connection between the two incidents, it would be difficult to convince his editor. Asakawa promised himself that if he couldn't dig up anything, he'd just shut up and leave it alone. Ah, if you'd only left it alone. Oh, if you could have only shut up and not have investigated this. But then, of course, we wouldn't have a story, would we? If there weren't idiots investigating and poking ghosts in the face. Chapter 4. Asakawa hung up the phone and stayed there like that for a while, motionless, his hand still on the receiver. The sound of his own unnecessarily excited voice, hanging on the other person's reaction, still echoed in his ears. He had a feeling he wasn't going to be able to do this. The person on the other end had taken the phone from his secretary with a suitably pompous tone, but as he'd listened to Asakawa's proposal, the tone of his voice had softened somewhat. At first, he'd probably thought Asakawa was calling about advertising. Then he'd done some quick calculating and realized the potential profit in having an article written about him. The top interview series had begun running in September. The idea was to spotlight a CEO who'd built up his company on his own, focusing on the obstacles he'd overcome and how. Considering he'd actually succeeded in getting an appointment to do the interview, Asakawa should have been able to hang up the phone with a little more satisfaction. But something weighed on him. All he'd hear from this Philistine was the same old corporate war stories, boasts about what a genius he was, how he'd seized his opportunities and clawed his way to the top. If Asakawa didn't thank him and stand up to leave, the tales of valor would go on forever. He was sick of it. He detested whoever had come up with this project. He knew all too well that the magazine had to sell ad space to survive, and that this kind of article laid the necessary groundwork for that. But Asakawa himself didn't much care if the company made money or lost it. All that mattered to him was whether or not the work was engaging. No matter how easy a job was physically, if it didn't involve any imagination, it usually ended up exhausting you. Asakawa headed for the archives on the 4th floor. He needed to do some background reading for the interview tomorrow, but more than that, there was something that was bothering him. The idea of an objective, casual relationship between the two incidents fascinated him. And then he remembered. He didn't even know how to begin, but a certain question had come to him in the furtive moment that his mind had wrested free of the voice of the Philistine. Were those two inexplicable sudden deaths indeed the only ones that had occurred at 11 p.m. on September 5th? If not, that is, if there had been other similar incidents, then the chances of them being a coincidence was practically nil. Asakawa decided to take a look at the newspapers from early September. Part of his job was reading the newspaper meticulously, but in this case he usually read only the headlines in the local news section, so there was more than just a chance that there was something he'd missed. He had a feeling there had been. He had the feeling that about a month ago, in the corner of a page in the local news section, he'd seen an odd headline. It had been a small article on the lower left-hand page. All he remembered was where it had appeared. He remembered reading the headline and thinking, hey. But then someone from the desk had called to him, and he'd gotten so distracted by work, he'd never actually read the article. With the buoyancy of a child on a treasure hunt, Asakawa began his search with the morning edition from September 6th. He was certain he'd find a clue. Reading month-old newspapers in the gloomy archives was giving him a sort of psychological uplift he never got from interviewing a Philistine. Asakawa was much more cut out for this kind of thing than for running around on the beat dealing with people of all sorts. The September 7th evening edition, that's where the article was, in just the position he remembered it being. Squeezed into a corner by news of a shipwreck that had claimed 34 lives, the article took up even less space than he'd recalled. No wonder he'd overlooked it. Asakawa took off his silver-rimmed glasses, buried his face in the newspaper, and pored over the article. Young couple dead of unnatural causes in rental car. At 6:15 a.m. on the 7th, a young man and woman were found dead in the front seats of a car on a vacant lot in Ashina, Yokosuka, along a prefectural road. The bodies were discovered by a truck driver who happened to pass by and who then reported the case to the Yokosuka police precinct. From the car registration, they were identified as a preparatory student from Shibuya, Tokyo, age 19, and a private girls' high school student from Isogo, Yokohama, age 17. The car had been rented from an agency in Shibuya 2 evenings previously by the preparatory school student. At the time of discovery, the car was locked with the key in the ignition. The estimated time of death was sometime between late night on the 5th and the pre-dawn hours of the 6th. Since the windows were rolled up, it is thought the couple fell asleep and asphyxiated, but the possibility they had taken an overdose of drugs in order to commit a love suicide has not been ruled out. The exact cause of death has not been determined. As of yet, there is no suspicion of homicide. This was all there was to the article, but Asakawa felt like he had a bite. First of all, the girl who died was 17 and attended a private girls' school in Yokohama, just like his niece, Tomoko. The guy who rented the car was 19 and a prep school student, just like the kid who died in front of Shinagawa Station. The estimated time of death was virtually identical. Cause of death unknown to... There had to be some connection among these 4 deaths. It couldn't take too long to establish definitive commonalities. After all, Asakawa was on the inside of a major news-gathering organization. He wasn't lacking for sources of information. He made a copy of the article and headed back to the editorial office. He felt like he'd just struck gold, and his pace quickened of its own accord. He could barely wait for the elevator. The Yokosuka City Hall Press Club. Yoshino was sitting at his desk, his pen scurrying across a sheet of manuscript paper. As long as the expressway wasn't crowded, you could make it here from the main office in Tokyo in an hour. Asakawa came up behind Yoshino and called his name. "Hey, Yoshino!" He hadn't seen Yoshino in a year and a half. "Huh? Hey, Asakawa, what brings you down to Yokosuka? Here, have a seat." Yoshino pulled up a chair toward the desk and urged Asakawa to sit. Yoshino hadn't shaved, and it gave him a seedy look, but he could be surprisingly considerate, among others. "You keepin' busy?" You could say that. Yoshino and Asakawa had known each other when Asakawa was still in the local news department, which Yoshino had entered 3 years ahead of him. Yoshino was 35 now. I called the Yokosuka... Why is this one word giving me problems? I called the Yokosuka office. That's how I learned you were here. Why? You need me for something? Asakawa handed him the copy he'd made of the article. Yoshino stared at it for an extraordinarily long time. Since he'd written the article himself, he should have been able to remember what it said just by looking at it. As it was, he sat there, concentrating all his nerves on it, hand frozen halfway through the motion of putting a peanut in his mouth. It was as if he were chewing it, recalling what he'd written, and digesting it. "What about it?" Yoshino had assumed a serious expression. "Nothing special. I just wanted to find out some details." Yoshino stood up. "All right, let's go next door and talk over a cup of tea or something." "Do you have time for this right now? Are you sure I'm not interrupting?" "Not a problem. This is more interesting than what I was doing." There was a little cafe right next to City Hall where you could get coffee for 200 yen a cup. Yoshino sat down and immediately turned to the counter and called out, "2 coffees." Then, turning back to Asakawa, he hunched over, leaning close. "Okay, look. I've been on the local beat for 12 years now. I've seen a lot of things. But never have I come across anything as downright odd as this." Yoshino paused for a sip of water, then continued. "Now, Asakawa, this has got to be a fair trade of information. Why is someone from the main office looking into this?" Asakawa wasn't ready to tip his hand. He wanted to keep the scoop for himself. If an expert like Yoshino caught wind of it, in a heartbeat he'd chase and nab the prize for himself. Asakawa promptly came up with a lie. "No special reason. My niece was a friend of the dead girl, and she keeps badgering me for information. You know, about the incident, so as long as I was down here..." It was a poor lie. He thought he saw Yoshino's eyes flash with suspicion, and he shrank back, unnerved. "Really?" "Yeah, well, she's a high school student, right? It's bad enough her friend's dead, but then there are the circumstances. She just keeps bugging me about it. I'm begging you, give me details." "So, what do you want to know? Did they ever decide the cause of death?" Yoshino shook his head. "Basically, they're saying their hearts just stopped all of a sudden. They have no idea why." "How about the murder angle? Strangulation, for example?" "Impossible. No bruise marks on the neck." "Drugs?" "No traces in the autopsy." "In other words, the case hasn't been solved." "Shit, no. No solving to be done. It isn't a murder. It's not even an incident, really. They died of some illness or some kind of accident, and that's all there is to it. Period. There's not even an investigation." It was a blunt way of putting it. Yoshino leaned back in his chair. "So why haven't they released the names of the deceased?" "They're minors. Plus, there's the suspicion it was a love suicide." At this point, Yoshino suddenly smiled, as if he'd just remembered something, and he leaned forward again. "You know the guy? He had his jeans and his briefs around his knees. The girl, too. Her panties were pulled down." "So it was coitus interruptus." "I didn't say they were doing it. They were just getting ready to do it. They were just getting ready to have a little fun, and bam! That's when it happened." Yoshino clapped his hands together for effect. "When what happened?" Yoshino was telling his story for maximum effect. "Okay, Asakawa, level with me. You've got something. I mean, something that connects with this case, right?" Asakawa didn't reply. "I can keep a secret. I won't steal your scoop either. It's just that I'm interested in this." Asakawa still remained silent. "Are you going to keep me hanging here in suspense?" "Should I tell?" "But I can't." I mustn't say anything yet, but lies aren't working. Sorry, Yoshino. Could you wait just a little longer? I can't tell you quite yet, but I will in 2 or 3 days, I promise. Disappointment clouded Yoshino's face. If you say so, pal. Asakawa gave him a pleading look, urging him to continue his story. Well, we've got to assume something happened. The guy and gal suffocate just when they're getting ready to do it? That's not even funny. I guess it's possible they'd taken poison earlier and it had only taken effect just then, but there were no traces. Sure, there are poisons that leave no trace, but you can't figure on a couple of students getting their hands on something like that. Yoshino thought of the place where the car had been found. He'd actually gone there himself and still had a clear impression. The car was parked on an overgrown piece of vacant land in a little ravine just off the unpaved prefectural road that led from Ashina to Mount Ukusu. Cars coming up the road could just catch the reflection of the taillights as they passed. It wasn't hard to imagine why the prep school kid who'd been driving had chosen this place to park in. After nightfall, hardly any cars used this road, and with the thick growth of trees providing cover, it made for a perfect hideaway for a penniless young couple. Then you've got this guy with his head jammed up against the steering wheel and the side window. Meanwhile, the girl's got her head buried between the passenger seat and the door. That's how they died. I saw them being taken out of the car with my own eyes. Each body came tumbling out the moment the doors were opened. It's like at the moment of death, some sort of force had been pushing them from the inside. Didn't stop when they died, but kept pushing for 30 hours or so, until the investigators opened the doors and then burst out. Are you with me here? This car was a 2-door, one of those where you can't lock the doors with the keys still inside. And the keys was in the ignition, but the doors... Well, you catch my drift. The car was completely sealed. It's hard to imagine that any force from the outside could have affected them. And what kind of expression do you suppose they had on their dead faces? They were both scared shitless, faces contorted with terror. Yoshino paused to catch his breath. There was a loud gulping sound. It wasn't clear which of them had swallowed his saliva. Think about it. Suppose just for the hell of it that some fearsome beast had come out of the woods. They'd have been scared and they would have huddled close to each other. Even if he hadn't, the girl would absolutely have clung to him. After all, they were lovers. But instead, their backs were pressed up against the doors, as if they were trying to get as far away from each other as they could. Yoshino threw up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Beats the hell out of me. If it hadn't been for the shipwreck in the waters off Yokosuka, the article might have been given more space, and if it had, there would have been a lot of readers who would have enjoyed trying to solve the puzzle playing detective. But, a consensus had spread, an atmosphere among the investigators and everybody else who had been at the scene. They all thought more or less the same thing, and all of them were on the verge of blurting it out, but nobody actually did. That kind of consensus. Even though it was completely impossible for 2 young people to die of heart attacks at exactly the same moment, even though none of them really believed it, everybody told themselves the medical lie that it had happened just like that. It wasn't that people refrained from saying anything out of fear of being laughed at for being unscientific. It was that they felt they'd be drawing themselves into some unimaginable horror by admitting it. It was more convenient to indulge in the scientific explanation, no matter how unconvincing it was. A chill ran up Asakawa's spine and Yoshino's simultaneously. Unsurprising, they were both thinking the same thing. The silence only confirmed the premonition which was welling up in each man's breast. It's not over. It's only just begun. No matter how much scientific knowledge they fill themselves with, on a very basic level, people believe in the existence of something that the laws of science can't explain. When they were discovered, where were their hands? Asakawa suddenly asked. On their heads. Or, well, it was more like they were covering their faces with their hands. Were they by any chance pulling at their hair, like this? Asakawa tugged at his own hair to demonstrate. Huh? In other words, were they tearing at their heads or pulling out their hair or anything like that? No, I don't think so. I see. Could I get their names and addresses, please? Sure, but don't forget your promise. Asakawa smiled and nodded, and Yoshino got up. As he stood, the table swayed, and their coffee spilled into their saucers. Yoshino hadn't even touched his. I love that everybody's in the chat like, how much is 200 yen? Here, let's find out. How much is 200 yen? I got my Google up. $200 is $1.91. Little less than $2 for a cup of coffee. That's not bad, especially depending on the size. Chapter 5. Asakawa kept investigating the 4 victims' backgrounds whenever he had a free minute, but had so much work to do he wasn't getting as far as he'd hoped. Before he knew it, a week had passed. It was a new month, and both August's rain-soaked humidity and September's summery heat became distant memories pushed aside by the signs of deepening autumn. Nothing happened for a while. He'd been making a point of reading every inch of the local news pages, but without coming across anything remotely similar. Or was it just that something horrible was advancing, slowly but surely, where Asakawa couldn't see? But the more time elapsed, the more inclined he was to think the 4 deaths were just coincidences, unconnected in any way. He hadn't seen Yoshino since then either. He'd probably forgotten the whole thing too. If he hadn't, he would have contacted Asakawa by now. Whatever his passion for the case showed signs of waning, Asakawa would take 4 cards out from his pocket and be reminded once again it couldn't have been a coincidence. On the cards, he'd written the deceased's names, addresses, and other pertinent information, and on the remaining space, he planned to record their activities during the months of August and September, their upbringing, and anything else his research turned up. Card 1. Tomoko Oishi. Date of birth, 10/21/72. Keisei School for Girls, Senior, age 17. Address, 17 Motomachi, Hanmoku, Naka Ward, Yokohama. Approximately 11 p.m. September 5th. Dies in the kitchen on first floor of home while parents away. Cause of death, sudden heart failure. Card 2. Suichi Iwata. Date of birth, 5/26/71. Ishin Preparatory Academy, first year, age 19. Address, 1523 Nishi Nakanobu, Shinagawa Ward, Tokyo. 10:54 p.m., September 5th. Falls over and dies at intersection in front of Shinagawa. Cause of death, cardiac infarction. Card 3. Haruko Tsuji. Date of birth, 1/12/73. Keisei School for Girls, Senior, age 17. Address, 519 Mori, Isogo Ward, Yokohama. Late night, September 5th, or early next morning. Dies in car off Prefecture Road at foot of Mount Okusu. Cause of death, sudden heart failure. Card 4. Takahiko Nomi. Date of birth, 12/4/70. Ishin Preparatory Academy, second year, age 19. Address, 1104 Uhara, Shibuya Ward, Tokyo. Late night, September 5th, or early next morning. Dies with Haruko Tsuji in car at foot of Mount Okusu. Cause of death, sudden heart failure. Tomoko Oshi and Haruko Tsuji went to the same high school and were friends. Suichi Iwata and Takahiko Nomi studied at the same prep school and were friends. This much had been clear prior to legwork, which indeed confirmed it. And from the simple fact that Tsuji and Nomi had gone for a drive together on Mount Okusu in Yokosuka on the night of September 5th, it was obvious that they were, if not quite lovers, at least fooling around. When he'd asked her friends, he'd heard the rumor that Tsuji had been dating a prep school guy from Tokyo. However, Asakawa still didn't know when or how they'd met. Naturally, he suspected that Oshi and Iwata were going out too, but he couldn't find anything to back this up. It was equally possible that Oshi and Iwata had never even seen each other, in which case, what was there to link these 4? They seemed far too closely related for this unknown being to have picked them totally at random. Maybe there was some secret that only the 4 of them knew and they'd been killed for it. Asakawa tried out a more scientific explanation with himself. Perhaps the 4 of them had been in the same place at the same time, and all 4 had been infected with a virus that attacks the heart. Hey now, Asakawa shook his head as he walked. A virus that causes sudden health failure? Come on. He climbed the stairs, muttering to himself, a virus, a virus. Indeed, he should start out with attempts at scientific explanation. Well, suppose there was a virus that caused heart attacks. At least it was a little more realistic than imagining that something supernatural was behind it all. It seemed less likely to get him laughed at. Even if such a virus hadn't yet been discovered on Earth, maybe it had just recently fallen to Earth inside a meteor, or maybe it had been developed as a biological weapon and had somehow escaped. You couldn't rule out the possibility. Sure, he'd try thinking of it as a virus for a while. Not that this would satisfy all his doubts. Why had they all died with looks of astonishment on their faces? Why had Suji and Nomi died on opposite sides of the small car, as if they were trying to get away from each other? Why hadn't the autopsies revealed anything? The possibility of an escaped germ weapon could at least answer the third question. There would have been a gag order. If he were to pursue this hypothesis further, he could deduce that the fact that there hadn't been any other victims yet meant the virus was not airborne. It was either bloodborne like AIDS or fairly non-contagious. But more importantly, where could the four have picked it up? He'd have to go back and sift through their activities in August and September again, and look for places and times they had in common. Since the participants' mouths had been shut permanently, it wouldn't be easy. If their meeting had been a secret among the four of them, something neither parents nor friends knew about, then how was he to ferret it out? But he was sure that these four kids had some time, some place, something in common. Sitting down at his word processor, Asakawa chased the unknown virus from his thoughts. He needed to get out the notes he'd just taken, to sum up the contents of the cassette he'd made. He had to get this article finished today. Tomorrow, Sunday, he and his wife Shizu were going to visit his sister, Yoshimi Oishi. He wanted to see with his own eyes the spot where Tomoko had died, to feel on his own flesh whatever air still lingered. His wife had agreed to go to Hanmoku to console her bereaved older sister. She had no inkling of her husband's true motives. Asakawa started pounding the keys of the word processor before he'd come up with a decent outline. It's very fascinating, isn't it? Chapter 6. Shizu was seeing her parents for the first time in a month. Ever since their granddaughter Tomoko had died, they came to Tokyo from their home in Ashikaga whenever they could, not only to console their daughter, but to be consoled in turn. Shizu only understood this today. Her heart ached when she saw her aged parents' thin, grief-stricken faces. They had once had 3 grandchildren, their oldest daughter Yoshimi's daughter Tomoko, their second daughter Kazuko's son Kenichi, and Shizu's daughter Yoko. 1 grandchild from each of their 3 daughters. Not all that common. Tomoko had been their first grandchild, and their faces had crinkled up every time they'd seen her. They had enjoyed spoiling her. Now they were so depressed it was impossible to say whose grief was deeper, the parents or the grandparents. I guess grandchildren really mean a lot. Shizu had just turned 30 this year. It was all she could do to imagine what her sister must be feeling, putting herself in her sister's place, contemplating how she'd feel if she lost her own child. But really, there was no comparison to be made between her daughter Yoko, only a year and a half old, and Tomoko, who had died at 17. She couldn't fathom how every passing year would deepen her love for her child. Sometime after 3 in the afternoon, her parents began to get ready to go home to Ashikaga. Shizu could hardly contain her surprise. Why had her husband, who had always protested he was too busy, suggest this visit to her sister's house? This was the same husband who'd skipped the poor girl's funeral, pleading he had a deadline to meet. And now here it was, almost dinner time, and he wasn't showing the slightest inclination of leaving. He'd only met Tomoko a few times and had probably never talked with her for very long. Surely he wasn't feeling detained by memories of the deceased. Shizu tapped Asakawa lightly on the knee and whispered in his ear, "Dear, it's probably about time. Look at Yoko. She's sleepy. Maybe we ought to see if we could let her nap here." They had brought their daughter. Normally this was nap time. Sure enough, Yoko had started blinking like she did when she was sleepy. But if they let her sleep here, they'd have to stay in this house for at least 2 more hours. What would they find to talk about with her grieving sister and her husband for 2 more hours? "She can sleep on the train, don't you think?" said Shizu, dropping her voice. "Last time we tried that, she got fussy, and it was awful all the way home. No thanks." Whenever Yoko got sleepy in a crowd, she got unbelievably fidgety. She'd flail her little arms and legs, wail at the top of her lungs, and just generally make life difficult for her parents. Scolding her only made it worse. There was no way to calm her down except to try and get her to sleep. At times like that, Asakawa became intensely conscious of the looks of people around him, and he'd start sulking himself, as though he were the prime victim of his daughter's shrieking. The accusing stares of the other passengers always made him feel like he was choking. Hey, DNA, welcome. Shizu preferred not to see her husband in that state, with his cheeks twitching nervously and all. All right then, if you say so. Great, let's see if she can take a nap upstairs. Yoko lay in her mother's lap, eyes half closed. I'll go put her down, he said, caressing his daughter's cheek with the back of his hand. The words sounded strange coming from Asakawa, who hardly ever helped with the baby. Maybe he'd had a change of heart, now that he'd witnessed the sorrow of parents who'd lost a child. What's come over you today? It's spooky. Don't worry, she looks like she'll go right down. Leave it to me. Shizu handed the child over. Thanks. I just wish you were like this all the time. As she was transferred from her mother's bosom to her father's, Yoko began to scrunch up her face. But before she had time to follow through, she fell asleep. Asakawa climbed the stairs, cradling his daughter. The second floor consisted of 2 Japanese-style rooms and the Western-style room, which had been Tomoko's. He laid Yoko on the futon in the Japanese-style room that faced south. He didn't even need to stay with her as she fell asleep. She was already out, her breathing regular. Asakawa slipped out of the room and listened to see what was going on downstairs, and then entered Tomoko's bedroom. He felt a little guilty about invading a dead girl's privacy. Wasn't this the kind of thing he abhorred? But it was for a good cause, defeating evil. There was nothing but to do it. Even as he thought this, he hated the way he was always willing to seize on any reason, no matter how specious, in order to rationalize his actions. But he protested it wasn't like he was writing an article about it. He was just trying to figure out when and where the 4 had been together. Sorry. He opened her desk drawers. Just the normal assortment of stationery supplies like any high school girl would have, rather neatly arranged. 3 snapshots, a junk box, letters, a notepad, a sewing kit. Had her parents gone through here after she died? It didn't look like it. Probably she was just naturally neat. He was hoping to find a diary. It would save him a lot of time. Today I got together with Haruko Tsuji, Takahiko Nomi, and Suichi Iwata, and we... If he could just find an entry like that. He took a notebook from her bookshelf and flipped through it. He actually came across a very girlish diary in the back of a drawer, but there were only a few desultory entries on the first few pages, all of them dated long ago. On the shelf beside the desk, there were no books, only a red-flowered makeup stand. He opened the drawer, a bunch of cheap accessories, a lot of mismatched earrings. It seemed she had a habit of losing one of every pair she owned. A pocket comb with several slender black strands of hair still wrapped around it. Opening the built-in wardrobe, his nose was assailed by the scent of high school girls. It was packed tight with colorful dresses and skirts on hangers. His sister-in-law and her husband had obviously not figured out what to do with these clothes, which still carried their daughter's fragrance. Asakawa picked up his ears at what was going on downstairs. He wasn't sure what they'd think if they caught him in here. There was no sound. His wife and her sister must still be talking about something. Asakawa searched the pockets of the clothes in the wardrobe one by one. Handkerchiefs, movie ticket stubs, gum wrappers, napkins, commuter pass case. He examined it. A pass for the stretch between Yamate and Tsurumi, a student ID card, and a membership card. There was a name written on the membership card. Something or other Nonoyama. He wasn't sure how to pronounce the characters for the first name. Yuki, maybe? From the characters alone, he couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Why did she have someone else's card in her pass case? He heard footsteps coming up the stairs. He slipped the card into his pocket, put the case back where he'd found it, and shut the wardrobe. He stepped into the hall just as his sister-in-law reached the top of the stairs. Sorry, is there a bathroom up here? He made a show of acting antsy. It's at the end of the hall. She didn't seem to suspect anything. Is Yoko sleeping like a good girl? Yes, thanks. Sorry to put you to such trouble. Oh no, not at all. The sister-in-law bowed slightly, then stepped into the Japanese-style room, hand on her kimono sash. In the bathroom, Asakawa took out the card. Pacific Resorts Club Members Card, it read. Underneath this was Nonoyama's name and membership number and the expiration date. He flipped it over. 5 membership conditions in fine print, plus the name of the company and its address. Pacific Resorts Club, Inc., 35 Kojimachi, Chiyoda Ward, Tokyo. Phone number 032614922. It wasn't something he'd found or swiped. Tomoko must have borrowed this card from this Nonoyama person. Why? To use Pacific Resorts facilities, of course. Which one, and when? He couldn't call from the house. Saying he was going to buy cigarettes, he ran to a payphone. He dialed the number. Hello, Pacific Resorts, how may I help you? A young woman's voice. I'd like to know what facilities I can use with a membership card. The voice didn't respond right away. Maybe they just had so many facilities available she couldn't list them all. That is, for example, like on an overnight trip from Tokyo, he added. It would have stood out if the four of them had gone away for 2 or 3 nights together. The fact that he hadn't turned up anything so far meant they'd probably gone for no longer than a single night. She could easily get away for a single night by lying to her parents and saying she was at a friend's house. We have a full range of facilities at our Pacific Land in South Hakone, she said in her business-like manner. Specifically, what sorts of leisurely activities do you have there? Certainly, sir. We have provisions for golf, tennis, and field sports, as well as a swimming pool. And you have lodging there? Yes, sir. In addition to a hotel, Pacific Land features the Villa Log Cabin community of rental cottages. Shall I send you our brochure? Yes, please. He pretended to be a prospective customer, hoping it would make it easier to extract information from her. The hotel and the cabins, are they open to the general public? Certainly, at non-member rates. I see. Can you give me the phone number? Maybe I'll go have a look. I can take care of reservations now if you wish. No, I may be going for a drive down there sometime and decide to have a look. So could I have the phone number? One moment, please. As he waited, Asakawa took out a memo pad and pen. Are you ready? The woman returned and dictated 2 11-digit phone numbers. The area codes were long. They were way out in the sticks. Asakawa scribbled them down. Just for future reference, where are your other facilities located? We have the same sort of full-service resorts at Lake Hamana and at Hamajima in Mie Prefecture. Much too far. Students wouldn't have had that kind of war chest. I see. Sounds like they're all in the Pacific, just like the name says. Then the woman began to detail all the fabulous advantages of becoming a Pacific Resorts Club member. Asakawa listened politely for a while before cutting her off. Great. The rest I'm sure I can find out from the pamphlet. I'll give you my address so you can send it. He told her his address and hung up. Listening to her sales pitch, he'd begun to think it actually wouldn't be a bad idea to join if he could afford it. It had been over an hour since Yoko had gone to sleep, and Shizu's parents had already returned to Ashikaga. Shizu herself was in the kitchen doing the dishes for her sister, who was still prone to break down at the slightest provocation. Asakawa briskly helped carry dishes in from the living room. What's gotten into you today? You're acting weird, said Shizu, without interrupting her dishwashing. You put Yoko down, you're helping in the kitchen. Are you turning over a new leaf? If so, I hope it sticks. Asakawa was lost in thought and didn't want to be bothered. He wished his wife would act like her name, which meant quiet. The best way to seal a woman's mouth was not to reply. What a lovely guy. I honestly don't think he's the worst dude, but clearly he's married to his work. And it's only later I think that he realizes, oh, I love my family too. Oh, by the way, did you put a disposable on her before putting her to bed? We wouldn't want her to leak at someone else's house. Asakawa showed no interest, but just looked around at the kitchen walls. Tomoko had died here. There had been shards of glass and a pool of coke next to her when she was found. She must have been attacked by the virus right when she was going to have a drink of coke from the fridge. Asakawa opened the refrigerator, mimicking Tomoko's movements. He imagined holding a glass and pretending to drink. What in the world are you doing? Shizu was staring at him, mouth open wide. Asakawa kept going, still pretending to drink. He looked behind him. When he turned around, there was a glass door right in front of him, separating the living room from the kitchen. It reflected the fluorescent light above the sink. Maybe because it was still bright outside and the living room was filled with light, it only reflected the fluorescent light, and not the expressions of the people on this side. If the other side of the glass was dark and this side light, like it would have been that night when Tomoko was standing here, the glass door would have been a mirror reflecting the scene in the kitchen. It would have reflected Tomoko's face, contorted with terror. Asakawa could almost start to think of that pane of glass as a witness to everything that had happened. Glass could be transparent or reflective, depending on the interplay of light and darkness. Asakawa was bringing his face nearer the glass as if drawn there, when his wife tapped him on the back. Just at that moment, they heard Yoko crying upstairs. She was awake. Alright, I'm gonna pause real quick. My dog's freaking out downstairs, so I'm gonna go make sure she's okay. She is howling like a hound dog. I don't know what's up with that, but we're gonna read a little longer when I come back. I grabbed a little snack. She's fine. It wasn't even her. It was my brother's dog. Which is why I didn't recognize the bark. I was like, is she okay? What's going on? My brother went to the store, and so his dog is sad. Poor puppy. Yoko's up. Shizu wiped her wet hands on a towel. Their daughter didn't usually cry so hard upon waking up. Shizu rushed up to the second floor. As she was going out, Yoshimi came in and Asakawa handed her the card he'd found. This had fallen under the piano. He spoke casually and waited for a reaction. Yoshimi took the card and turned it over. This is strange. What was this doing here? She cocked her head, puzzled. Could Tomoko have borrowed it from a friend, do you suppose? But I've never heard of this person. I don't think she had a friend by that name. Yoshimi looked at Asakawa with exaggerated worry. Darn it, this looks important. I swear, that girl... Her voice choked up. Even the slightest thing would set the wheels of grief in motion for her. Asakawa hesitated to ask, but did. Did Tomoko and her friends by any chance go to this resort during summer vacation? Yoshimi shook her head. She trusted her daughter. Tomoko hadn't been the kind of child to lie about staying over at a friend's. Plus, she'd been studying for exams. Asakawa could understand how Yoshimi felt. He decided not to ask about Tomoko any further. No high school student with exams looming in front of her was going to tell her parents she was renting a cottage with her boyfriend. She would have lied and said she was studying at a friend's house. Her parents would never know. I'll find the owner and return it. Yoshimi bowed her head in silence, and then her husband called from the living room and she hurried out of the kitchen. The bereaved father was sitting in front of a newly installed Buddhist altar, speaking to his daughter's photograph. His voice was shockingly cheerful, and Asakawa became depressed. He was obviously living in denial. Asakawa could only pray he'd be able to get through it. Asakawa had found one thing. If this Nonoyama had in fact lent Tomoko the membership card, he or she would have contacted Tomoko's parents to ask for the card upon learning of her death. But Tomoko's mother knew nothing about the card. Nonoyama couldn't have forgotten about the card. Even if it were part of a family membership deal, dues were expensive enough that Nonoyama wouldn't just allow the card to stay lost. So what did this mean? This was how Asakawa figured it. Nonoyama had lent the card to one of the other three, either Iwata, Tsuji, or Nomi. Somehow it passed into Tomoko's possession, and that's how things had ended. Nonoyama would have contacted the parents of the person he or she lent it to. The parents would have searched their child's belongings. They wouldn't have found the card. The card was here. If Asakawa contacted the families of the other 3 victims, he might be able to unearth Nonoyama's address. He should call right away, tonight. If he couldn't dig up a clue this way, then it would be unlikely the card would provide a means for finding when and where the 4 had been together. At any rate, he wanted to meet Nonoyama and hear what he or she had to say. If he had to, he could always find some way to track down Nonoyama's address based on the membership number. Asking Pacific Resorts directly probably wouldn't get him anywhere, but he was sure his newspaper connections could come up with something. Someone was calling him, a distant voice. "Dear, dear!" His wife's flustered voice mingled with the baby's crying. "Dear, could you come here a second?" Asakawa came to himself again. Suddenly he wasn't even sure what he'd been thinking about all this time. There was something strange about the way his daughter was crying. That feeling became stronger as he mounted the stairs. "What's wrong?" he asked his wife accusingly. "Something's not right with Yoko. I think something's happened to her. The way she's crying. It's different from how it usually sounds. Do you think she's sick?" Asakawa placed his hand on Yoko's forehead. She didn't have a fever, but her little hands were trembling. The trembling spread to her whole body, and sometimes her back shook. Her face was beet red, her eyes clenched shut. How long has she been like this? It's because she woke up and there was no one here with her. The baby often cried if her mother wasn't there when she woke up, but she always calmed down when her mother ran to her and held her. When a baby cried, it was trying to ask for something, but what? The baby was trying to tell them something. She wasn't just being bratty. Her 2 tiny hands were clasped tightly over her face, cowering. That was it. The child was wailing out of fear. Yoko turned her face away and then opened her fists slightly. She seemed to be trying to point forward. Asakawa looked in that direction. There was a pillar. He raised his eyes. Hanging about 30 centimeters from the ceiling was a fist-sized mask of a Hanya, a female demon. Was the child afraid of the mask? "Hey, look," said Asakawa, pointing with his chin. They looked at the mask simultaneously, then slowly turned their gazes to each other. "No way. She's frightened of a demon." Asakawa got to his feet. He took down the demon mask from where it hung on the beam and laid it face down on top of the dresser. Yoko couldn't see it there. She abruptly stopped crying. "What's the matter, Yoko? Did that nasty demon scare you?" Shizu seemed relieved now that she understood, and she happily rubbed her cheek against the child's. Asakawa wasn't so easily satisfied. For some reason, he didn't want to be in this room any longer. "Hey, let's go home," he urged his wife. That evening, as soon as he got home from the Oishis, he called the Sujis, the Nomis, and the Iwatas, in that order. He asked each family whether they hadn't been contacted by one of their child's acquaintances regarding a membership card for a resort. The last person he spoke to, Iwata's mother, gave him a long, rambling answer. "There was a call from someone who'd said he'd gone to the same high school as my son, an older boy saying he'd lent my son his resort membership card and could he get it back. But I searched every corner of my son's room and never could find it. I've been worried about it ever since." He quickly asked for Nonoyama's phone number and immediately called it. Nonoyama had run into Iwata in Shibuya on the last Sunday in August and lent him the card, just as Asakawa had suspected. Iwata had told him he was going away with his high school girl he'd been hitting on. "Summer vacation's almost over, you know. I really want to live it up once before it's over, or else I won't be able to buckle down and study for exams." Nonoyama had laughed when he'd heard this. "You idiot, prep school students aren't supposed to have summer vacations." The last Sunday in August had been the 26th. If they'd gone anywhere for the night, it would have had to been the 27th, 28th, 29th, or 30th. Asakawa didn't know about the college prep school, but for the high school girls at least, fall semester began on the 1st of September. Take a bite. I'm just eating sausage. You ever just want sausage? It's delicious. Gandalf wants it. Bad kitty. Maybe it was because she was tired from being so long in unfamiliar surroundings. Yoko soon fell asleep right next to her mother. When he put his ear to the bedroom door, he could hear both of them breathing regularly, fast asleep. 9 in the evening. This was Asakawa's time to relax. Until his wife and child were asleep, there was no room in the tiny condo for him to settle down to work. Asakawa got a beer from the fridge and poured it into a glass. It tasted special tonight. He'd made definite progress finding that membership card. There was a good chance that sometime between the 27th and the 30th of August, Suichi Iwata and the other three had stayed at facilities belonging to Pacific Resorts. The most likely place was the Villa Log Cabin at Pacific Land in South Hakone. South Hakone was the only Pacific Resorts property close enough to be a viable candidate, and he couldn't imagine a group of poor students going all out and staying at a hotel. They would probably have used the membership to rent one of the cottages on the cheap. They were only 5,000 yen a night for members, which came to a little over 1,000 apiece. He had the phone number for Villa Log Cabin at hand. He put his notes on the table. The quickest thing would be to simply call the front desk and ask if a party of 4 had stayed there under the name Nonoyama, but they'd never tell him over the phone. Naturally, anybody who had risen within the firm to the position of rental cottage manager would have been trained well to consider it his duty to protect his guests' privacy. Even if he revealed his position as a reporter for a major newspaper and clearly stated his reasons for inquiring, the manager would never tell him over the phone. Asakawa considered contacting the local bureau and getting them to use a lawyer with whom they had connections to ask for a look at the guest register. The only people a manager was legally bound to show the register were the police and attorneys. Asakawa could try to pose as one or the other, but he'd probably be spotted immediately, and that would mean trouble for the newspaper. It was safer and more effective to go through channels. But that would take at least 3 or 4 days, and he hated to wait that long. He wanted to know now. His passion for the case was such he couldn't bear to wait 3 days. What in the world was going to come of this? If indeed the 4 of them had stayed the night at Villa Log Cabin at Pacific Land in South Hakone at the end of August, and if indeed that clue allowed him to unravel the riddle of their deaths, what could it have been anyway? Virus. He was all too aware that the only reason he was calling it a virus was to keep himself from being overawed by the thought of some mysterious thing being behind it all. It made sense, to a degree, to marshal the power of science in facing down supernatural power. He wasn't going to get anywhere fighting a thing he didn't understand with words he didn't understand. He had to translate the thing he didn't understand into words he did. Asakawa recalled Yoko's cries. Why was she so frightened when she saw the demon mask this afternoon? On the way home on the train, he'd asked his wife, "Have you been teaching Yoko about demons?" "What?" "You know, with picture books or something like that." "Have you been teaching her to be afraid of demons?" "No way, why would I?" The conversation had ended there. Shizu was unconcerned, but Asakawa worried. That kind of fear only existed on a deep, spiritual level. It was different from fearing something because you'd been taught to fear it. Ever since he'd come down out of the trees, man had lived in fear of something or other. Thunder, typhoons, wild beasts, volcanic eruptions, the dark. The first time a child experiences thunder and lightning, he or she feels an instinctive fear. That was understandable. To begin with, thunder was real. It really existed. But what about demons? The dictionary would tell you demons were imaginary monsters or the spirits of dead people. If Yoko was going to be afraid of the demon because it looked scary, she should also have been afraid of models of Godzilla. After all, they were made to look fearsome too. She'd seen one once in a department store show window, a cunningly made Godzilla replica. Far from being frightened, she had stared at it intently, eyes glowing with curiosity. How did you explain that? The only thing he knew for sure was that Godzilla, no matter how you looked at it, was an imaginary monster. So what about demons? And are demons unique to Japan? No, other cultures have the same type of thing. Devils. The second beer wasn't tasting as good as the first one. Is there anything else Yoko's afraid of? That's right, there is. Darkness. She's terribly afraid of the dark. She absolutely never goes into an unlit room alone. Yoko. Sun child. But darkness, too, really existed, as light's opposite pole. Even now, Yoko was asleep in her mother's embrace in a dark room. That is part 1 of The Ring. How many parts are in this? I feel like we should probably call it there, even though I am enjoying reading this. It is quite fun. Part 2... Part 2 is Highlands. Part 3 is Gusts. Part 4 is... Oh, wow. Part 3 is long. Part 4. Looks like there's 4 parts. And the last one, the third one is the longest one, it seems like. So, yeah, I think we'll call it there. Don't want to risk my voice going out. It's such a fun book. I really love the setup. It's really lovely. We will read more next week. Probably gonna do Don't stop. Aw, guys. I guess I could go a little longer. You guys want me to go a little longer? Where were we? Part 2. Where was part 2? I'm gonna bite my sausage. Everybody seems very upset by the fact that we were gonna stop there. Nobody's bored. It's been an hour and a half. This is a very good book, though. I've read 2/3 of it. I'm in part 3. Alright, let me finish this. I'll read a little more. Chapter 1 of Part 2. October 11, Thursday. The rain was coming down harder now, and Asakawa turned his wipers on high. The weather at Hakone was liable to change at any moment. The skies had been clear down in Odawara, but the higher he climbed, the moister the air, and as he neared the pass, he'd encountered several pockets of wind and rain. If it had been daytime, he would have been able to guess at the weather on the mountains from the appearance of the clouds over Mount Hakone. But it was night, and his attention was fixed on whatever came into the beam of his headlights. It wasn't until he'd stopped the car and looked up at the sky that he realized the stars had disappeared. When he got on the Kodama bullet train at Tokyo Station, the city had still been wrapped in twilight. When he'd rented the car at Atami Station, the moon was still intermittently peeking out from gaps in the clouds. But now the fine water droplets drifting across his headlight beams were growing into a full-fledged downpour, pounding on his windshield. Hey, Jessica, welcome! The digital clock over the speedometer said 7:32. Asakawa quickly calculated how long it had taken him to come this far. He'd taken the 516 down from Tokyo, arriving in Atami at 6:07. By the time he'd left the gates and finished the paperwork at the rent-a-car place, it had been 6:30. He'd stopped at a market and bought 2 packs of cup of noodles and a small bottle of whiskey. What a dinner. It had been 7 by the time he'd found his way through the maze of one-way streets and out of town. A tunnel loomed in front of him, its entrance outlined in brilliant orange light. On the other side, just after he entered the Atami-Kanami Highway, he should start to see signs for South Hakone Pacific Land. The long tunnel would take him through the Tana Ridge. As he entered it, the sound of the wind changed. At the same time, his flesh, the passenger seat, and everything else in the car was bathed in orange light. He could feel his calm slipping away. He could feel his hackles rise. There were no cars coming from the opposite direction. The wipers squeaked as they rubbed against the now dry windshield. He turned them off. He should reach his destination by 8. He didn't quite feel like flooring it, although the road was empty. Subconsciously, Asakawa was dreading the place he was coming to. At 4:20 this afternoon, Asakawa had watched as a fax had crawled out of the machine at the office. It was a reply from the Atami Bureau, and he had expected it to contain a copy of the Villa Log Cabin's guest register for the August 27th through the 30th. When he saw it, he did a little dance. His hunch was right. There were 4 names he recognized: Nonoyama, Tomoko Oshi, Haruko Tsuji, and Takahiko Nomi. The 4 of them had spent the night of the 29th in cabin B4. Obviously, Suichi Iwata had used Nonoyama's name. With this, he knew when and where the 4 had been together. On Wednesday, August 29th, at South Hakone Pacific Land, Villa Log Cabin, number B4. It was exactly a week prior to their mysterious deaths. There and then, he'd picked up the receiver and dialed the number for Villa Log Cabin to make a reservation for tonight for cabin B4. All he had tomorrow was a staff meeting at 11. He could spend the night down in Hakone and easily be back in time. Well, that's it. I'm going to the actual place. He was eager. Never in his wildest dreams could he imagine what awaited him there. There was a toll booth just as he came out of the tunnel, and as he handed over 300 yen coins, he asked the attendant, Is South Hakone Pacific Land up ahead? He knew full well it was. He'd checked his map any number of times. He just felt like it had been a long time since he'd seen another human being, and something within him wanted to talk. There's a sign just up ahead. Make a left there. He took his receipt. With so little traffic, it hardly seemed worth having someone stationed here. How long was this guy planning to stand there in his booth? Asakawa made no move to drive off, and the man began to give him a suspicious look. Asakawa forced a smile and pulled away slowly. The joy he'd felt a few hours ago at establishing a common time and place for the 4 victims had withered and died. Their faces flickered behind his eyelids. They'd died exactly 1 week after staying in Villa Log Cabin. Now's the time to turn back, they seemed to be telling him, leering. But he couldn't turn back now. First of all, his instincts as a reporter had kicked into gear. On the other hand, there was no denying that he was scared to be going alone. If he'd called Yoshino, chances were he would have come running, but he didn't think having a colleague along was such a good idea. Asakawa had already written up his progress so far and saved it on a floppy disk. What he wanted was someone who wouldn't run around getting in his way, but simply help him pursue this. It wasn't like he didn't have someone in mind. He did know one man who would tag along out of pure curiosity. He was a part-time lecturer at the university, so he had plenty of free time. He was just the guy. But he was idiosyncratic. Asakawa wasn't sure how long he could take his personality. There, on the mountainside, was the sign for South Hakone Pacific Land. There was no neon, just a white panel with black lettering. If he'd happened to be looking away with when his headlights hit it, he would have missed it completely. Asakawa turned off the highway and began climbing a mountain road between terraced fields. The road seemed awfully narrow for the entrance to a resort, and he had lonely visions of it dead-ending in the middle of nowhere. He had to shift down to negotiate the road's steep, dark curves. He hoped he didn't encounter anybody coming from the opposite direction. There was no room for 2 cars to pass. The rain had let up at some point, although Asakawa had just noticed it. The weather patterns seemed different east and west of the Tana Ridge. At any rate, the road didn't dead-end, but kept climbing higher and higher. After a while, he started to see summer homes scattered here and there on the side of the road, and the road suddenly widened to 2 lanes. The surface improved drastically, and elegant streetlights graced the shoulders. Asakawa was amazed at the change. The minute he entered the grounds of Pacific Land, he was confronted with lavish accoutrements. So what was with the garden path that led here? The corn and weeds hanging over the road had narrowed it even further, heightening his nervousness over what lay around the next hairpin curve. The 3-story building on the other side of the spacious parking lot doubled as an information center and a restaurant. Without thinking twice, Asakawa parked in front of the lobby and walked toward the hall. He looked at his watch. 8 on the nose. Somebody asking about female character? Let's see. Have I ever tried... Oh, I have not done voice acting, but that would be fun. It's supposed to be scarier if it's a female character. I think at least in Japan, the reason you see a lot of ghost stories and a lot of horror stories in Japan have female characters is because there's a tradition in Shinto that says women are more attuned to ghosts and spirits and magic. Literally, the director of Fatal Frame said once we decided it was a ghost story, obviously the main character had to be female. That's just the rule. I don't know about other cultures, but Japan, it's definitely because of that religious tradition of women being more spiritual. Of course, this story is a little different. Without thinking twice, Asakawa parked in front of the lobby and walked toward the hall. He looked at his watch, 8 on the nose. Right on schedule. From somewhere he heard the sound of balls bouncing. There were 4 tennis courts below the center with several couples giving it their all under the yellowish lights. Surprisingly, all 4 courts were occupied. Asakawa couldn't fathom what made people come all the way up here at 8 on a Thursday night in the middle of October just to play tennis. Far below the tennis courts, he could see the distant lights of the cities of Mishima and Numazu, glittering in the darkness. The emptiness beyond, black as tar, was Tago Bay. As he entered the information center, the restaurant was directly in front of him. Its outer wall was glass so he could see inside. Here, Asakawa got another surprise. The restaurant was closed at 8, but it was still half full of families and young women in groups. What was going on here? He cocked his head in puzzlement. Where had everybody come from? He couldn't believe all these people came here on the same road that had brought him here. Maybe what he had used was the back entrance. There must be a brighter, wider road somewhere else. But that was how the girl he'd spoken to on the phone had told him to get here. Go about halfway down the Atami Kanami Road and turn left. Drive up the mountain from there. Asakawa had done just that. It was inconceivable that there was another way out of here. Nodding as he was told it was past time for last orders, he went into the restaurant. Below its wide windows, a carefully groomed lawn sloped gently through the night toward the cities. The inside lights were kept intentionally low, probably to better allow customers to enjoy the view of the distant lights. Asakawa stopped a passing waiter and asked where he could find Villa Log Cabin. The waiter pointed back toward the entry hall Asakawa had come through. Follow that road to the right about 200 meters. You'll see the office. Is there a parking lot? You can park in front of the office. That was all there was to it. If he'd just kept going instead of stopping in here, he would have found it on his own. Asakawa could more or less analyze why he'd been drawn to this modern building, to the point of barging into the restaurant. He found it somehow comforting. All the way here, he had been imagining dark, utterly primitive log cabins, the perfect backdrop for a Friday the 13th scenario, and there was nothing of that in this building. Faced with the proof that the power of modern science functioned here, he felt somewhat reassured, strengthened. The only thing that bothered him was the bad road that led here from the world below, and the fact that in spite of it, there were so many people playing tennis and enjoying their dinner here in the world above. He wasn't sure exactly why this bothered him. It was just that somehow nobody here seemed quite lifelike. Since the tennis courts and restaurant were crowded, he should have been able to hear the cheerful voices of people from the log cabins. That's what he expected. But standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking down over the valley, he could discern only about 6 of the 10 cabins built among the trees scattered over the gentle slope. Everything below was immersed in darkness, beyond the pale of the street lamps, unrelieved by any light coming from inside the cabins. B4, where Asakawa would be spending the night, seemed to stand on the border between the darkness and the lighted area. All he could see was the top of the door. Asakawa walked up to the office, opened the door, and stepped inside. He could hear a television, but there was no sign of anyone. The manager was in a Japanese-style room in the back, off to the left, and hadn't noticed Asakawa. Asakawa's view was blocked by the counter, and he couldn't see into the room. The manager seemed to be watching an American movie on video, not a TV program. He could hear English dialogue as he watched the flickering light from the screen reflected in the glass of a cabinet out front. The built-in cabinet was full of videotapes, neatly lined up in their cases. Asakawa placed his hands on the counter and spoke up. Immediately, a small man in his 60s stuck his head out and bowed, saying, "Oh, welcome." He must be the same man who'd so cheerfully showed the guest register to the guy from the Atami Bureau and the lawyer, thought Asakawa, smiling back at him pleasantly. "I have a reservation, name of Asakawa." The man opened his notebook and confirmed the reservation. "You're in B4. Can I get you to write your name and address here?" Asakawa wrote his real name. He'd just sent Nono Yama's membership card back to him, so he couldn't use it. "Just you, then?" The manager looked up at Asakawa suspiciously. He'd never had anybody stay here alone. At non-member rates, it was more economical for one person to stay at the hotel. The manager handed over a set of sheets and turned to the cabinet. If you'd like, you're free to borrow one. We have most of the popular titles." "Oh, you rent videos?" Asakawa ran his gaze casually over the titles of the videos covering the wall. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, Back to the Future, Friday the 13th. All popular American films, mostly science fiction. A lot of new releases, too. Probably the cabins were mostly used by groups of young people. There was nothing that grabbed him. Besides, Asakawa had ostensibly come here to do work. I'm afraid I've brought work with me. Asakawa picked up his portable word processor from where he placed it on the floor and showed the manager. Seeing it, the manager seemed to understand why he was here alone. So there are dishes and everything? Asakawa said, just to be sure. Yeah, you would use whatever you'd like. The only thing Asakawa needed to use, though, was a kettle to boil water for his cup of noodles. He took the sheets and his room key from the manager, who told him how to find B4, and then said with odd formality, "Please make yourself at home." Got a lot of 80s horror movies. Well, this is set in the past, but I think it might be in the late 80s. Isn't that what he said? It's 1990, okay. Before touching the knob, Asakawa put on his rubber gloves. He'd brought them to give him peace of mind, as a charm to ward off the unknown virus. He opened the door and flipped on the light switch in the entry hall. A 100-watt bulb lit a spacious living room. Papered walls, carpet, 4-person sofa, television, dinette set. Everything was new. Everything was functionally arranged. Asakawa took off his shoes and went in. There was a balcony on one edge of the living room and small Japanese-style rooms on the ground and guest floors. It was a little luxurious for a single guest, after all. He drew the lace curtains and opened the sliding glass door to allow the night air in. The room was perfectly clean, as if to betray his expectations. It suddenly occurred to him he might go home clueless. He went into the Japanese-style room off the living room and checked the closet. Nothing. He took off his shirt and slacks and changed into a sweatshirt and sweatpants. Hanging his street clothes in the closet. Next he went upstairs and turned on the light in the Japanese-style room. I'm acting like a child, he thought wryly. Before he realized it, he turned on every single light in the place. With everything sufficiently illuminated, With everything sufficiently illuminated, he now opened the bathroom door, gently. He checked inside first and left the door slightly ajar while he was inside. It reminded him of his fear rituals as a child, when he was too scared to go to the bathroom alone on summer nights. He used to leave the door open a crack and have his dad stand watch outside. A neat shower room stood behind a pane of frosted glass. There wasn't even a hint of steam, and the area outside the tub and the tub itself were dry as a bone. It must have been some time since anybody had stayed here. He went to take off his rubber gloves. They stuck to his sweaty hands. The cool Highland breezes blew into the room, disturbing the curtains. Asakawa filled a glass with ice from the freezer and poured it half full of the whiskey he bought. He was about to top it off with tap water, but then hesitated. Turning off the tap, he persuaded himself he'd really rather have it straight, on the rocks. He didn't have the courage to put anything from this room in his mouth. He'd been careless enough to use ice cubes from the freezer, but he was under the impression that microorganisms didn't like extreme heat or cold. He sank back deep into the sofa and turned on the TV. Singing filled the room, some new pop idol. A Tokyo station was showing the same program right about now. He changed channels. He didn't really intend to watch anything, though. So he adjusted the volume to a suitable level and opened his bag. He took out a video camera and placed it on the table. If anything strange happened, he wanted to catch it all on tape. He sipped a mouth of whiskey. It was only a little, but it strengthened his courage. Asakawa went over in his head again everything he knew. He went in over his head. He doesn't know it, but he is. If he couldn't find a clue here tonight, then the article he was trying to write would be dead in the water. But on the other hand, maybe it was better that way. If not finding a clue meant not picking up the virus, well, after all, he had a wife and child to think about. He didn't want to die, not in some weird way. He propped his feet up on the table. So what are you waiting for? He asked himself. Aren't you afraid? Hey, shouldn't you be afraid? The angel of death might be coming to get you. His gaze darted around the room nervously. Asakawa couldn't fix his eyes on any one point on the wall. He had the feeling that if he did so, his fears would begin to take physical form while he watched. A chill wind blew in from outside, stronger than before. He closed the windows, and as he went to draw the curtains, he happened to glance at the darkness outside. The roof of B5 was directly in front of him, and its shadow, the darkness, was even deeper. There had been lots of people on the tennis courts and in the restaurant, but here Asakawa was alone. He shut the curtains and looked at his watch. 8:56. He hadn't even been in this room for 30 minutes. It easily could have been an hour or more, he felt. But just being here wasn't dangerous in and of itself. He tried to believe that, to calm himself down. After all, how many people must have stayed in B4 in the 6 months since these cabins were built? It wasn't like all of them had died under mysterious circumstances. Only these 4, according to his research. Maybe if he dug deeper, he'd find more, but at the moment that appeared to be all. Thus, simply being here wasn't the problem. The problem was what they had done here. So what did they do here? Asakawa then subtly rephrased the question. What could they have done here? He found nothing resembling a clue. Not in the bathroom, not in the bath, not in the closet, not in the fridge. Even assuming there had been something, the manager would have disposed of it when he cleaned the place. Which meant that, instead of sitting here drinking whiskey, he should be talking to the manager. That would be quicker. He drained his first glass. He made his second a little smaller. He couldn't afford to get drunk. He put a lot of ice in it, and this time he cut it with tap water. His sense of danger must have been numbed a little. He suddenly felt foolish. Stealing time from work, coming all the way up here. He took off his glasses, washed his face, then looked at his reflection in the mirror. It was the face of a sick man. Maybe he'd already caught the virus. He gulped down the whiskey and water he'd just made and fixed himself another. Returning from the dining room, Asakawa noticed a notebook on the shelf beneath the telephone stand. The cover said memories. He leafed through a few pages. Saturday, April 7th. Nonko will never forget this day. Why? That's a secret. Yuichi is wonderful. Hee hee. Heart. Inns, B&Bs, and the like often had notebooks like this in the room, so guests could write down their memories and impressions. On the next page was a crude drawing of Mommy and Daddy. Must have been a family trip. It was dated April 14th, also a Saturday, naturally. Daddy's fat, Mommy's fat, so I'm fat too. April 4th. Asakawa kept turning pages. He could feel some sort of force urging him to open the pages at the end of the book, but he kept going through them in order. He was afraid if he messed up the chronology, he might miss something. He couldn't say for sure, since they were probably a lot of guests who didn't write anything, but it seemed like there were only people here on Saturdays until summer started. After that, the time between each entry shrank. By the end of August, there was a steady stream of entries lamenting the end of summer. Sunday, August 20th. Another summer vacation come and gone, and it sucked. Somebody help me. Rescue poor little me. I have a motorbike, 400cc. I'm pretty good looking. A bargain. AY. This guy looked like he'd decided the guest book was a means to advertise himself, maybe find a pen pal. It looked like a lot of people had the same ideas about the place. When couples stayed here, their entries showed it, while when single people stayed, they wrote about how much they wanted a companion. Still, it made for interesting reading. Presently, his watch showed 9 o'clock. Then he turned the page. Thursday, August 30th. Ugh, consider yourself warned. You'd better not see it unless you've got the guts. You'll be sorry you did. Evil laughter. S.I. That was all there was to the message. August 30th was the morning after the 4 had stayed here. The initials S.I. would stand for Suichi Iwata. His entry was different from all the rest. What did it mean? You'd better not see it. What in the world was it? Asakawa closed the guest book and looked at it from the side. There was a slight gap where it didn't close tightly. He put his finger there and opened it to that page. Ulp, consider yourself warned. You'd better not see it unless you've got the guts. You'll be sorry you did. Evil laughter. S.I. The words jumped out at him. Why did the book want him to open to this exact page? He thought for a moment. Perhaps the 4 had opened the book here and set something heavy on top of it. The weight had created this force that remained even now, trying to open to this page. And maybe whatever they'd placed on top of the page was the it that he'd better not see. That must be it. Asakawa looked around anxiously, searching every corner of the shelf beneath the telephone stand. Nothing, not even a pencil. He sat back down on the sofa and continued reading. The next entry was dated Saturday, September 1st. But it only said the usual things. It didn't say if the group of students who'd stayed here had seen it. None of the remaining pages mentioned it either. Asakawa closed the guest book and lit a cigarette. You'd better not see it unless you've got the guts. He imagined that it must be something frightening. He opened the notebook at random and pressed down on the page lightly. Whatever it was must have been heavy enough to overcome the page's tendency to close. 1 or 2 photos of ghosts, for example, wouldn't have done the trick. Maybe a weekly or a hardcover book. Thank you, brain. Anyway, something you look at. Maybe he'd ask the manager if he remembered finding anything strange left in the cabin after the guests had checked out on August 30th. He wasn't sure if the manager would even remember, but he figured that if it had been strange enough, he would. Asakawa began to get to his feet when the VCR in front of him caught his eye. The TV was still on, showing a famous actress chasing her husband around with a vacuum, a home appliance commercial. Yeah, a VHS tape would be heavy enough to keep the notebook open, and they might have had one handy, too. Still in a crouch, Asakawa ground out his cigarette. He recalled the video collection he'd seen in the manager's office. Maybe they'd happened to watch a particularly interesting horror flick and thought they'd recommend it to the next guests. Hey, this one's cool, check it out. If that's all it was. But wait, if that's all it was, why hadn't Shuichi Iwata used the name? If he wanted to tell somebody that, say, Friday the 13th was a great movie, wouldn't it have been easier just to say Friday the 13th was a great movie? He didn't need to go to all the trouble of leaving it on the top of the notebook. So maybe it was something that didn't have a name, something they could only indicate with the word it. Well, worth checking out? Well, he certainly didn't have anything to lose, not with no other clues presenting themselves. Besides, sitting around here wasn't getting him anywhere. Asakawa left the cabin, climbed the stone steps, and pushed open the office door. Just as before, there was no sign of the manager at the counter, only the sound of the television coming from the back room. The guy had retired from his job in the city and decided to live out his years surrounded by Mother Nature, so he'd taken a job as a manager at a resort. But the work turned out to be utterly boring, and now all he did every day was watch videos. That's how Asakawa interpreted the situation. Before he had a chance to call the guy, though, he crawled to the doorway and stuck his head out. Asakawa spoke somewhat apologetically. I thought maybe I'd borrow a video after all. The manager grinned happily. Go right ahead, whichever you'd like. They're 300 yen each. Asakawa scanned the titles for scary-looking movies. The Legend of Hell House, The Exorcist, The Omen. He'd seen them all in his student days. Nothing else? There had to be something he hadn't seen. He searched from one end of the shelves to the other and saw nothing that looked likely. He started over, reading the titles of every one of the 200 or so videos. And then, on the very bottom shelf, way over in the corner, he noticed a video without a case, fallen over on its side. All the other videos were encased in jackets with photos and imposing logos, but this one lacked even a label. What's that there? After he'd asked the question, Asakawa realized he'd used a pronoun, that, as he pointed to the tape. If it didn't have a name, what else was he supposed to call it? The manager gave a bothered frown and replied none too brightly, Huh? Then he picked it up. This isn't anything. I wonder if this guy even knows what's on the tape. Have you seen it, that one? Asked Asakawa. Let me see. The manager cocked his head repeatedly, as if he couldn't figure out what something like this was doing here. If you don't mind, could I borrow that tape? Instead of replying, the manager slapped his knee. I remember now. It was kicking around in one of the rooms. I just figured it was one of ours and brought it here, but this wouldn't have happened to be in B4, I don't suppose. Asakawa asked slowly, pressing the point home. The manager laughed and shook his head. I haven't the foggiest. It was a couple of months ago. Asakawa asked once more. Have you seen this video? The manager just shook his head. The smile disappeared from his face. No. Well, let me rent it. You're going to record something on the TV? Yeah, well, The manager glanced at the video. The tab is broken, see? You can't record on it. Maybe it was the alcohol, but Asakawa was getting irritated. I'm telling you to rent it to me, you idiot. Just hand it over, he griped to himself. But no matter how drunk he was, Asakawa was never able to come on very strong with other people. Please, I'll give it right back. He bowed. The manager couldn't figure out why his guest was showing so much interest in this old thing. Maybe there was something interesting on it, something somebody had forgotten to erase. Now he wished he'd watched it when he found it. He felt the sudden temptation to watch it right now, but he couldn't very well refuse a guest who'd asked for it. The manager handed over the tape. Asakawa reached for his wallet, but the manager stopped him with his hand. "That's all right, you don't need to pay. I can't charge you for this now, can I?" "Thanks a lot, I'll bring it back." "If it turns out to be interesting, then please do." The manager's curiosity had been piqued. He'd already seen every video here at least once, and most of them had ceased to interest him. How did I miss that one anyway? It would have killed a few hours. But it was probably only some stupid TV show recorded anyway. The manager was sure the video would come back right away. Chapter 2. The tape had been rewound. It was an ordinary 120-minute tape, the sort you could get anywhere, and as the manager pointed out, the anti-erasure tabs had been broken off. Asakawa turned on the VCR and pushed the tape into the slot. He sat down cross-legged right in front of the screen and pressed play. He heard the capstan start to turn. He had high hopes that the key to unlock the riddle of 4 people's deaths was hidden on this tape. He pushed play, fully intending to be satisfied with just a clue. Any clue. There can't be any danger, he was thinking. What harm could come just from watching a videotape? Random sounds and distorted images flickered on the screen, but once he had selected the right channel, the picture steadied. Then the screen went black as ink. This was the video's first scene. There was no sound. Wondering if it had broken, he brought his face close to the screen. "Consider yourself warned. You'd better not see it. You'll be sorry you did." Suichi Iwata's words came back to him. Why should he be sorry? Asakawa was used to things like this. He covered the local news. No matter what sort of horrific images he might be shown, he felt confident he wouldn't regret watching. In the middle of the black screen, he thought he saw a pinpoint of light begin to flicker. It gradually expanded, jumping around to the left and right before finally coming to rest on the left-hand side. Then it branched out, becoming a frayed bundle of lights, crawling around like worms, which finally formed themselves into words. Not the kind of captions one normally saw on film, though. These were poorly written, as if scrawled by a white brush on jet black paper. Somehow, though, he managed to make out what they said. "Watch until the end." A command. These words disappeared, and the next floated up into view. "You will be eaten by the lost." The last word didn't make much sense, but being eaten didn't sound too pleasant. It seemed there must have been an "or else" implied there. Don't turn off the video halfway through, or else something awful will happen. It was a threat. "You will be eaten by the lost." The words grew larger and chased all the black from the screen. It was a flat change from black to milk white. It was a patchy, unnatural color, and it began to resemble a series of concepts painted on a canvas one after another. The unconscious, squirming, worrying, finding an exit, spurting out, or maybe it was the throb of life. Thought had energy, bestially satiating itself on darkness. Strangely, he felt no desire to push stop. Not because he was unafraid of whatever wanted to eat him, but because this intense outpouring of energy felt good. Something red burst onto the monochrome screen. At the same time, he heard the ground rumble from an indefinable direction. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, such that he began to imagine the whole cabin was shaking. It didn't feel like the sound was coming from those little speakers. The sluggish red fluid exploded and flew about, sometimes occupying the whole screen, from black to white, and now red. It was nothing but a violent succession of colors. He hadn't seen any natural scenery yet, just concepts in the abstract, etched vividly into his brain by the brilliantly shifting colors. It was tiring, actually, and then, as if it had read the viewer's mind, the red retreated from the screen and a mountain vista stretched out. At one glance, he could tell it was a volcano with a gentle peak. The volcano was sending up white puffs of smoke against a clear blue sky. The camera seemed to be situated somewhere at the foot of the mountain, where the ground was covered with rugged, blackish-brown lava. Again, the screen was swathed in darkness. The clear blue sky was instantaneously painted black, and then, a few seconds later, a scarlet liquid spurted out from the center of the screen, flowing downward. A second explosion. The spray thrown up by it burned red, and as a result, he could begin to make out faintly the outline of the mountain. The images were now more concrete where they had previously been abstract. This was clearly a volcanic eruption, a natural phenomenon, a scene that could be explained. The molten lava flowing from the mouth of the volcano threaded its way down through ravines and headed this way. Where was the camera positioned? Unless it was an aerial shot, it looked like the camera was about to be swallowed up. The rumblings of the earth increased until the whole screen seemed about to be engulfed in molten rock, and then the scene abruptly changed. There was no continuity from one scene to the next, only sudden shifts. Thick black letters floated into view against a white background. Their edges were blurred, but he somehow managed to make out the character for mountain. It was surrounded by black splatters, as if it had been written sloppily by a brush dripping with ink. The character was motionless. The screen was calm. Another sudden shift. A pair of dice tumbling around in the rounded bottom of a lead bowl. The background was white, the bottom of the bowl was black, and the one on the die was red. The same three colors he'd seen so often already. The dice rolled around soundlessly, finally coming to rest, a 1 and a 5. The single red dot and the 5 black ones arranged on the white faces of the die. What did it mean? In the next scene, people appeared for the first time. An old woman, face lined with wrinkles, sat perched on a pair of tatami mats on a wooden floor. Her hands rested on her knees, and her left shoulder was thrust slightly forward. She was speaking slowly, looking straight ahead. Her eyes were different sizes. When she blinked, it looked like she was winking instead. She was speaking in an unfamiliar dialect, and he could only catch every other word or so. Your health, sense, spend all your time, bound to get to you. Understand? Be careful of, you listen to Granny now, because there's no need to. The old, expressionless woman made her statement, then vanished. There were a lot of words he didn't understand, but he had the impression he'd just been lectured to. She was telling him to be careful of something, warning him. Who was this old lady talking to, and about? The face of the newborn baby filled the screen. From somewhere he could hear a baby's first cry. This time, too, he was sure it didn't come from the television speaker. It came from very near, beneath his face. It was very like a real voice. On screen, he could now see hands holding the baby. The left hand was under its head, and the right was behind its back, holding it carefully. They were beautiful hands. Totally absorbed by the image, Asakawa found himself holding his own hands in the same position. He heard the birth cry directly below his chin. Startled, he pulled back his hands. He'd felt something warm and wet, like amniotic fluid or blood, and the weight of flesh. Asakawa jerked his hands apart as if casting something aside, and brought his palms close to his face. A smell lingered, the faint smell of blood. Had it come from the womb, or... His hands felt wet, but in reality they weren't even damp. He restored his gaze to the screen. It still showed the baby's face. In spite of the crying, its face was swathed in a peaceful expression, and the shaking of its body had spread to its groin, even wiggling its little thing. The next scene, 100 human faces. Each one displayed hatred and animosity. He couldn't see any distinguishing features other than that. The myriad faces, looking as if they had been painted on a flat surface, gradually receded into the depths of the screen, and as each face diminished in size, the total number increased, until they had swollen to a great multitude. It was a strange multitude, though, existing only from the neck up, but the sounds welling up from them befit a crowd. Their mouths were shouting something, even as they shrank and multiplied. He couldn't quite make out what they were saying. It sounded like the commotion of a great gathering, but the voices were tinged with criticism, abuse. The voices were not welcoming or cheering. Finally, he made out a word, liar, and another, fraud. By now there were perhaps 1,000 faces. They had become nothing but black particles filling the screen until it looked like the television had been turned off. But the voices continued. It was more than Asakawa could bear. All that criticism directed right at him. That was how it felt. When the next scene appeared, it showed a television on a wooden stand. It was an old-fashioned 19-inch set with a round channel selector, and a rabbit ear antenna sat on its wooden cabinet. Not a play within a play, but a TV within a TV. The television within had nothing on its screen yet, but it seemed to be on. The red light by the channel knob was lit. Then the screen within the screen wavered. It stabilized and then wavered again, over and over with increasing frequency. Then a single character appeared hazily. Sada. The word faded in and out of focus, distorted, and began to look like another before disappearing altogether, like chalk on a blackboard wiped with a wet rag. As he watched, Asakawa began to find it hard to breathe. He could hear his heartbeat, feel the pressure of the blood flowing in his veins. A smell, a touch, a sour, sweet taste stabbing his tongue. Strange. Something was stimulating his 5 senses, some medium besides the sounds and visions that appeared as if it were suddenly recalling them. Then the face of a man appeared. Unlike the previous images, this man was definitely alive. He had a pulsating vitality. As he watched, Asakawa began to feel hatred toward him. He had no idea why he should hate this man. He wasn't particularly ugly. His forehead sloped a bit, but other than that, he was actually rather well-formed. But there was something dangerous in his eyes. They were the eyes of a beast closing in on its prey. The man's face was sweaty. His breathing was ragged. His gaze was turned upward, and his body was moving rhythmically. Behind the man grew scattered trees. The afternoon sunlight shone between their branches. The man brought his eyes down and looked straight ahead again, and his gaze locked with the viewer's. Asakawa and the man stared at each other for a while. The stifling sensation grew, and he suddenly wanted to tear his gaze away. The man was drooling. His eyes were bloodshot. His neck muscles began to fill the screen in a close-up, then disappeared off the left side of the screen. For a while, only the black shade of the trees could be seen. A scream began to well up from deep down inside. At the same time, the man's shoulder came back into view, then his neck, and finally his face again. His shoulders were bare, and the right one carried a deep, bloody gash, several centimeters long. Drops of blood seemed to be sucked toward the camera, growing larger and larger until they hit the lens and clouded over the view. The screen cut to black once, twice, almost like blinking. And when the light returned, everything was red. There was a murderous look in the man's eye. His face drew closer along with his shoulder, the bone peeking out where the flesh had been gouged out. Asakawa felt a violent pressure on his chest. He saw trees again. The sky was spinning. The color of the sky faded into sunset, the rustling of dry grass. He saw dirt, then weeds, and then sky again. Somewhere he heard a baby crying. He wasn't sure if it was the little infant from before. Finally, the edge of the screen turned black, darkness gradually encroaching in a ring on the center. Dark and light were clearly defined now. At the center of the screen, a small round moon of light floated in the middle of the darkness. There was a man's face in the moon. A fist-sized clump of something fell from the moon, making a thud. Another, and then another. With each sound, the image jumped and swayed. The sound of flesh being smashed, and then true darkness. Even then, a pulse remained. Blood still circulated, throbbing. The scene went on and on. A darkness that seemed as if it would never end. Then, just as at the beginning, the words faded into view. The writing in the first scene had been crude, like that of a child just learning to write. But this was somewhat better. White letters drifting into view and then fading, read, "Those who have viewed these images are fated to die at this exact hour 1 week from now. If you do not wish to die, you must follow these instructions exactly." Asakawa gulped and stared wide-eyed at the television, but the scene changed yet again. A complete and utter change. A commercial came on, a perfectly ordinary, common television commercial. A romantic old neighborhood on a summer's evening, an actress in a light cotton robe sitting on her veranda, fireworks lighting up the night sky, a commercial for mosquito-repelling coils. After about 30 seconds, the commercial ended, and just as another scene was about to start, the screen returned to its previous state. Darkness with the last afterglow of faded words, then the sound of static as the tape ended. Bug-eyed, Asakawa rewound the tape and replayed the last scene. The same sequence repeated itself. A commercial interrupted the most important point. Asakawa stopped the video and turned off the television, but he kept staring at the screen. His throat was parched. What the hell? There was nothing else to say. One unintelligible scene after another, and the only thing he'd comprehended was that anybody who watched would die in exactly a week. And the part which told him how to avoid his fate had been taped over with a commercial. Who erased it? Those four? Asakawa's jaw quivered. If he didn't know that the four young people had died simultaneously, he could have laughed this off as sheer nonsense. But he knew. They had died, mysteriously, as predicted. At that moment, the phone rang. Asakawa's heart nearly jumped out of his chest at the sound. He picked up the receiver. He felt as though something were concealing itself, watching him from the darkness. "Hello," he finally managed to croak. There was no reply. Something was swirling around in a dark, cramped place. There was a deep rumble, as if the earth were resounding and the damp smell of soil. There was a chill at his ear, and the hairs on the nape of his neck stood up. The pressure on his chest increased, and bugs from the bowels of the earth were crawling on his ankles and his spine, clinging to him. Unspeakable thoughts and long-ripened hatred almost reached him through the receiver. Asakawa slammed down the receiver. Covering his mouth, he ran to the bathroom. Chills ran up and down his backbone. Waves of nausea swept over him. The thing on the other end of the line hadn't said anything, but Asakawa knew what it wanted. It was a confirmation call. You've seen it now. You know what it means. Do like it said, or else. Asakawa vomited over the toilet. He didn't have much to throw up. The whiskey he'd drunk earlier flowed out of him now, mixed with bile. The bitterness seeped into his eyes, squeezing out tears. It hurt his nose. But he felt that if he threw up everything now, here, maybe the images he just watched would go flowing out of him, too. "If I don't what? I don't know! What do you want me to do, huh? What am I supposed to do?" He sat on the bathroom floor and yelled, trying not to give in to his fear. "Look, those four erase the important part. I don't understand it. Help me out here." All he could do was make excuses. Asakawa jumped back from the toilet, not even realizing how awful he looked, and peered around the room in every direction, bowing his head in supplication to whatever might be there. He didn't realize he was trying to look pathetic, to draw sympathy. Asakawa stood up and rinsed his mouth at the sink, swallowing some water. He felt a breeze. He looked at the living room window. The curtains were trembling. "I thought I shut that." He was certain that before drawing the curtains, he'd shut the sliding glass door tightly. He remembered doing it. He couldn't stop trembling. For no reason at all, the image of skyscrapers at night flashed across his brain, the way the lighted and unlighted windows formed a checkerboard pattern, sometimes even forming characters. If you saw the buildings as huge, oblong tombstones, the lights were epitaphs. The image disappeared, but the white lace curtains still danced in the breeze. In a frenzy, Asakawa grabbed his bag from the closet and threw his things inside. He couldn't stay here a moment longer. "I don't care what anybody says. If I stay here, I won't last the night. Forget about the week." Still in his sweats, he stepped down into the entryway. He tried to think rationally before going outside. Don't just run away in fear. Try to figure out some way to save yourself. An instantaneous survival instinct. He went back into the living room and pushed the eject button. He wrapped the videotape tightly in a bath towel and stowed it in his bag. The tape was his only clue. He couldn't afford to leave it behind. Maybe if he figured out the riddle as to how the scenes were connected, he'd find a way to save himself. No matter what, he only had a week left. He looked at his watch, 10:18. He was sure he'd finished watching at 10:04. Suddenly, the time seemed quite important to him. Asakawa left the key on the table and went out, leaving all the lights on. He ran to his car, not even stopping by the office first, and jammed his key in the ignition. "I can't do this alone. I'll have to ask him to help." Talking to himself, Asakawa put the car in motion, but he couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. No matter how he floored it, he couldn't seem to get up any speed. It was like being chased in a dream, running in slow motion. Over and over he looked at the mirror, but the black shadow chasing him was nowhere to be seen. And that's the end of part 2, which was quite short. Part 3 is incredibly long, and then part 4 is essentially the epilogue, it seems. Thanks for listening. We're gonna have to quit now because my voice will die if I continue, but we will continue next Saturday with part 3. It gets even more tense from here. I haven't finished it entirely, but I've read most of it, and it's quite good. It follows a lot of the same things in the movie, they just kind of happen with different characters and different things. So there's enough there that if you've seen the movie, you still won't know everything that's going on. And I think the language, the way that the book creates similar feelings of tension and horror that the movie does visually, is very interesting to compare the way that the two work. It's quite good. Thanks for listening. Thanks to all of our members who joined us, Billy, Delvin, Jeff. Thank you all for supporting the channel. If you would like to help the channel and support it, you can do so. Links are in the description. You get lots of bonus content and stuff. Links are in the description. Before we go, I thought I'd let you know, in the middle of reading, Bob decided that my lap was very comfortable. He spun around 3 times and got comfy. And there's Bob. Hey, Bob! And there's Gandalf. Got the kitty buddies. Bob, can you look up? Hey. 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 He does not want to pay any attention to us. Hey. Hey. He does not care. He says, I am asleep, mother. Leave me alone. Come on, can't you say hi for like a second? Bob. Yeah, I give you pettings under the chin. Yeah, there's those good pettings. Good pettings. Good pettings. Yeah. He says, leave me alone. I want to sleep. How about you, Gandalf? I give pettings? Yeah, give pettings? Yes. Pettings? Yes. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with Heaven Official's Blessing and probably Fire Emblem. Maybe watch TV. I don't know. We'll see what I have done today. And more stuff later in the week. I will see you guys next time. Bye.